Chapter 1, First Day. The humidity of the city clung to the streets like a damp wool blanket, but the moment Leela stepped into the lobby of Miller Enterprises, the air changed. It was cool, filtered, and smelled faintly of expensive ozone and success. Leela Vance smoothed the front of her charcoal gray pencil skirt for the 10th time. Dee spent 3 hours on her hair this morning, ensuring the dark waves were pinned back into a professional, yet soft, chignon. She needed this. Not just for the paycheck, though the paycheck was astronomical, but for the validation. For 3 years, she'd worked at a mid-level firm, fetching decaf lattes for men who didn't remember her name. Ethan Miller would remember her name. Everyone said he was a monster, but they also said he was a genius. And in the world of high-stakes corporate acquisitions, geniuses were the only ones who survived. "Floor 42, the security guard said, his voice echoing in the marble cavern of the lobby. He handed her a sleek, brushed metal ID badge. "Good luck, Miss Vance. You're going to need it." Leela offered a tight smile and headed for the elevators. As the doors slid shut, the silence of the lift was broken only by the faint hum of machinery. Her stomach did a nervous somersault. She watched the numbers climb. 10, 20, 30. When the doors opened on the 42nd floor, she was met with a vista of glass. The entire floor was open concept, but at the very end of the hall stood 2 massive oak doors. That was the inner sanctum. "You're late," a voice rumbled. Leela jumped, nearly dropping her leather briefcase. Standing by a sleek, minimalist desk was a woman in her 50s, wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than Leela's car. The elevator. "I'm Margaret, the outgoing senior assistant. I'm retiring, which is the only reason you're standing here," the woman said, her eyes scanning Leela with clinical precision. "Mr. Miller doesn't care about elevators. He cares about results. He's in a mood. The Tokyo merger is stalled, and he hasn't had his second espresso. Go in, don't stammer, and for heaven's sake, don't stare at him." Leela swallowed hard. "Don't stare." "He's distracting," Margaret said, a faint, knowing smirk touching her lips. "Go on." Leela approached the oak doors. She knocked once firmly. "Enter." The voice was deep, like the low notes of a cello, vibrating right through the wood and into Leela's chest. She pushed the doors open. The office was vast, but her attention was immediately pulled to the man standing behind a desk made of a single slab of black marble. Ethan Miller was taller than the magazines suggested. He was a silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Manhattan, his broad shoulders filling out a bespoke navy suit. He was looking at a series of monitors, his brow furrowed in a way that made him look both dangerous and incredibly handsome. He didn't look up. "Margaret, I told you the quarterly projections are." "I'm not Margaret," Leela said. Ethan froze. He slowly turned his head, and Leela felt the air leave her lungs. His face was a masterpiece of sharp angles, a jawline that could cut glass, a straight, noble nose, and eyes the color of a winter sea. They were cold, piercing, and currently fixed entirely on her. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just looked at her, his gaze traveling from her sensible heels up to her face, lingering for a fraction of a second on her mouth before meeting her eyes. "Leela Vance," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mr. Miller, my first day." "You're early," he countered, glancing at his Patek Philippe watch. "Margaret told you were late to rattle you. She likes to see if the new blood bleeds easily." Leela felt a flush creep up her neck. "I don't bleed easily, sir." Ethan walked around the desk. His movement was fluid, like a predator stalking across a field. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell him, a heady mix of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something uniquely him. It was an intoxicating, masculine scent that made her pulse skip. "Is that so?" Ethan murmured. He leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. The movement pulled the fabric of his shirt tight against his chest, hinting at the hard muscle beneath. "Because this office is a war zone, Leela. I work 20 hours a day. I expect my assistant to be my shadow, my gatekeeper, and my brain when I'm too tired to think. I've gone through 4 assistants this year. They all cried. One of them fainted." Leela squared her shoulders. "I don't faint, Mr. Miller, and I rarely cry." A slow, predatory smirk spread across his face. It wasn't a kind smile, it was a challenge. "Rarely, we'll have to see about that." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. Leela's heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she was sure he could hear it. He was so much larger than her, a towering presence that felt both intimidating and strangely magnetic. "Your resume says you're fluent in Mandarin and have a Master S in finance," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Why be an assistant?" "Because I want to see how a kingdom is run before I build my own," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Ethan's eyes darkened. A flicker of something, admiration, curiosity, passed through them. He reached out, his hand moving toward her face. Leela held her breath, her skin tingling in anticipation. But he didn't touch her. He reached behind her head to grab a file that was sitting on the credenza. The heat of his body radiated off him, and for a second she was trapped between the desk and his massive frame. "Ambitious," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "I like ambition. But remember, Leela, in this office there is only one king." He straightened up, the moment of intense proximity breaking as he tossed the file onto the desk. "Coffee, black, no sugar, then get with Margaret. I want the briefing for the sterling account on my desk by noon. If it's a minute late, don't bother coming back after lunch." "Yes, Mr. Miller," Leela said, turning to leave. "Leela." She stopped at the door, looking back. He was already looking at his monitors again, but his voice was low. "Fix your hair. A few strands are loose. It looks untidy." Leela touched her chignon, finding the loose lock of hair she'd missed. Her face burned. As she exited the office and closed the heavy oak doors, she leaned against the wall and took a ragged breath. She had been in the room with him for less than 10 minutes, and she already felt like she'd been branded. He was arrogant, demanding, and utterly impossible. He was also the most beautiful man she had ever seen. Leela straightened her skirt, tucked the loose strand of hair behind her ear, and headed for the break room. The lion's den was real, and she had just stepped right into the center of it. The game had begun. Chapter 2: Initial Tension. The second day didn't start with a good morning. It started with a red-stamped folder landing on Leela's desk at 7:15 a.m., followed by the sound of Ethan's heavy, rhythmic footsteps retreating into his office. Leela had arrived at 7:00 a.m. sharp, determined to be the first one in. She had barely managed to get her coat off and her computer booted up before the boss made his entrance. He hadn't even looked at her. He had simply dropped the folder and barked, "Reindex these. The legal team is incompetent, and I won't have their laziness reflected in my presentation." Now, 3 hours later, Leela's fingers were flying across the keyboard. Her neck was beginning to ache, and the third cup of coffee, this one for her, was sitting cold and forgotten near her elbow. Being Ethan Miller's assistant wasn't just a job, it was an endurance sport. Every time she thought she was ahead, he found something else. Every time she finished a task perfectly, he raised the bar just high enough to keep her reaching. The intercom buzzed, the sound sharp in the quiet, high-ceilinged space. Leela, my office. She took a breath, smoothed her skirt, a habit she was developing around him, and stood up. She grabbed her tablet and walked toward the oak doors. She knocked twice. Come in. When she entered, Ethan was standing by the window, his back to her. He had discarded his jacket, and his white dress shirt was tucked perfectly into his trousers. The fabric was thin enough to show the movement of his shoulder blades as he looked out over the city. You finished the re-indexing, he said. It wasn't a question. I did. I also cross-referenced the California statutes they missed. You'll find the addendum in the back of the folder. Ethan turned around slowly. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, held a spark of something she couldn't quite name. He walked to his desk, picked up the folder, and flipped to the back. Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Leela found herself watching the way his thumb moved against the paper, long, tanned fingers with neatly trimmed nails. Hands that looked like they belonged to a man who knew exactly how to take what he wanted. You're thorough, he murmured, his gaze still on the page. Most people would have just done what they were told. I don't like doing things halfway, Mr. Miller. He looked up then, and the intensity of his stare felt like a physical weight. No, I don't think you do. He leaned back against the edge of his desk, a position she was realizing was his favorite way to loom over her without actually moving. Tell me, Leela, why did you choose Miller Enterprises? With your credentials, you could be a junior analyst at any firm in the city. You're overqualified to be making my coffee and managing my calendar. Leela met his gaze, refusing to blink. I wanted to learn from the best, and analysts spend their time in cubicles looking at numbers. I wanted to see the person who makes the numbers move. Ethan's lips tilted in that half-smirk again. Careful, flattery is a cheap currency in this office. It isn't flattery if it's a fact, she countered. A low, rumbling chuckle escaped his chest. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and the sound was like velvet and gravel. It did something strange to her stomach, a fluttering heat that made her pulse quicken. Go to lunch, Leela, he said, his voice dropping. But be back in 45 minutes. We have the board meeting at 1, and I need you to be sharp. The board meeting was a masterclass in intimidation. Leela sat to Ethan's left, her tablet open, her stylus poised to take notes. Around the long mahogany table sat 12 men and 2 women, all of them older, all of them looking like they were waiting for Ethan to fail. He didn't. He was a shark in a 3-piece suit. He tore through their objections with a surgical precision that was both terrifying and deeply attractive. Leela found herself distracted, not by the complex financial jargon, but by Ethan himself. She watched the way his throat moved when he drank water. She watched the way he tapped a silver pen against the table, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. At one point, a board member challenged Ethan on the projected margins of the Tokyo acquisition. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The margins are correct because I made them correct, Ethan said, his voice a low, dangerous silk. If you can't see the vision, Arthur, perhaps you've been sitting in that chair too long. The room went dead silent. Leela felt a thrill run through her. It was power, pure, unadulterated power. Suddenly, Ethan's hand moved under the table. Leela froze as she felt his fingers brush against her knee. It was a fleeting contact, likely accidental as he adjusted his position, but the heat of it seared through her skirt. She looked at him, her breath catching, but his face was a mask of professional boredom as he waited for the board member's response. Did he know he'd touched her? Was it a mistake? His hand didn't move away immediately. It lingered just an inch from her thigh, the heat of him radiating through the small gap. Leela's heart was drumming against her ribs so hard she was sure the person sitting next to her could hear it. She tried to focus on her notes, but the words on the screen were a blur. When the meeting finally adjourned, the room emptied quickly, the board members scuttling away like beaten dogs. Leela stayed behind to gather her things, her hands trembling slightly. "You were quiet," Ethan said. She looked up. He was still sitting, watching her. The boss mask was still there, but there was a tilt to his head that suggested he was seeing right through her professional facade. "I was busy taking notes, sir." "Is that what you were doing?" He stood up and walked toward her. The room was empty now, the heavy doors closed. The silence was absolute. "Because for a moment there, you looked like you'd seen a ghost." He stopped right in front of her. He was so close she could see the dark ring around his pupils. "The room was a bit warm," Leela lied, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. Ethan reached out. For a second, she thought he was going to touch her face, and her body traitorously leaned into the anticipated contact. Instead, he reached past her to pick up a stray pen she'd left on the table. "Then we'll have to turn down the thermostat," he whispered. He held the pen out to her, but he didn't let go when she took it. They both held the silver cylinder, a tether connecting them. "I can't have my assistant losing her focus because of a little heat." His eyes dropped to her lips, and for a heartbeat, the air in the room seemed to vanish. The initial tension had moved from a simmer to a low boil. "I won't lose my focus," Leela promised, her voice a notch above a whisper. "Good," Ethan said, finally releasing the pen. "Because the day isn't over yet, and I have very high expectations for tonight." He turned and walked out, leaving Leela standing in the wreckage of her own composure. She looked down at the pen in her hand. Her knuckles were white. She was drawn to him. It was undeniable. It was a physical pull, like gravity, dragging her toward a man who was her boss, her superior, and a known predator in the boardroom. She told herself to be smart. She told herself this was just a crush, a reaction to his power and his looks. But as she watched him disappear through the double doors, Leela knew she was lying to herself. The tension wasn't just in the office. It was in her blood, and it was only getting stronger. Chapter 3: Late Night Work. The gold-plated clock on the wall of the executive suite ticked with a rhythmic, mocking precision. 10:14 p.m. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan had transformed. The frantic gray energy of the afternoon had bled into a sprawling tapestry of electric amber and neon violet. From this high up, the cars looked like slow-moving embers drifting through the canyons of the city. Inside, the office was silent, save for the low, industrial hum of the climate control and the frantic clicking of Leela's keyboard. The Jones acquisition had turned into a nightmare. A discrepancy in the offshore holdings had been discovered at 5:00 p.m., and Ethan had made it clear. No one was going home until the trail was found. By 8:00 p.m., the junior analysts had been dismissed with a wave of Ethan's hand. He didn't trust their tired eyes. By 9:00 p.m., even the night security guard had finished his first round. Now it was just the two of them. Leela rubbed her eyes, the blue light of the monitor burned into her retinas. She reached for her mug, but it was bone dry. She sighed, her shoulders drooping. "If you sigh any louder, Leela, the structural integrity of the building might be at risk." Ethan's voice came from the doorway of his private office. He had discarded his tie hours ago. His top two buttons were undone, and his sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing the powerful, corded muscles of his forearms. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man who had been in a beautiful, high-end brawl. "I'm just," Hit a wall with the Shell Company and the Caymans, Leela said, turning her chair to face him. Ethan didn't stay in his doorway. He walked toward her, his footsteps dampened by the thick carpet. The darkness of the office made the pool of light at her desk feel like a private island. "Let me see," he said. He didn't pull up another chair. Instead, he leaned over her desk, placing one hand on the back of her chair and the other on the desk's edge. He effectively caged her in. Leela's heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. The scent of him, that signature sandalwood and the faint, sharp tang of the espresso he'd been drinking, was overwhelming in the confined space. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, barely inches from her shoulder. "Look at the third line," she whispered, her voice suddenly breathy. "The routing number doesn't match the origin point." Ethan leaned in closer. His head was right next to hers. If she turned just 2 inches, her cheek would brush his. "You're right," he murmured. His voice was a low vibration that she felt in her own bones. "It's a ghost account. Clever, but not clever enough for you, apparently." He reached for the mouse, his hand covering hers. Leela's breath hitched. His palm was warm, his skin slightly rough against the back of her hand. He didn't move his hand away. He clicked through the folders, his fingers guiding hers, a slow and deliberate movement that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with the fact that he was touching her. "Ethan," she breathed, his name slipping out before she could catch it. She had never called him by his first name. The clicking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a sudden electric tension. Ethan didn't move his hand. He didn't pull back. Slowly, he turned his head. They were so close. Leela could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his dark lashes framed those icy blue eyes, eyes that were currently dark with an intensity that made her knees feel like water. "Say it again," he whispered. "What?" "My name, say it again." Leela swallowed hard. Her pulse was a frantic rhythm in her throat. "Ethan." His gaze dropped to her lips. The air in the room felt thick, like they were underwater. In the dim light, the professional boundaries that had felt so rigid during the day were dissolving. He wasn't her boss right now. He was a man, and she was a woman, and the pull between them was a physical force, as real as the gravity holding them to the floor. Ethan's hand shifted, his fingers sliding from the mouse to intertwine with hers. He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb grazing the soft skin of her palm. It was a small touch, but it felt like a lightning strike. "You should go home, Leela," he said, though he made no move to let her go. "It's late, you're tired." "I can finish this," she insisted, though her brain was no longer capable of processing numbers. All she could process was the way he was looking at her. "I know you can," he said. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers trailing slowly up her arm, barely touching her, just enough to set her skin on fire. He stopped at her shoulder, his thumb brushing the sensitive skin of her neck. "You're too good at everything you do. It's distracting." Leela's heart hammered. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Ethan whispered, leaning in until his forehead nearly touched hers. "You're making me lose my mind, Leela, and that isn't in your job description." He lingered there for a second, his breath ghosting over her lips. For a heartbeat, she thought, she hoped, he would kiss her. The anticipation was an ache in her chest. But then, with a sharp intake of breath, Ethan pulled back. The spell broke as he straightened up, the cold air of the office rushing into the space he'd vacated. "Go home," he said, his voice suddenly rough, his professional mask sliding back into place, though it was slightly crooked. "I'll finish the Cayman's report. That's an order." Leela sat there for a moment, her body still humming from his touch. She felt dazed, her senses reeling. "Yes, Mr. Miller." Leela. She looked up as she gathered her bag. He was standing in the shadows now, his face unreadable. Be careful on the way home. Text me when you're inside your apartment. Sigh, okay, I will. As she walked toward the elevators, she could feel his eyes on her. She didn't look back. Her hand was still tingling where he'd held it. The Jones acquisition didn't matter. The deadline didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the look in Ethan's eyes, the look of a man who was starving, and the realization that she was the only thing he wanted to consume. The elevator doors closed, and Leela leaned against the mirrored wall, her reflection looking back at her with wide, dark eyes and flushed cheeks. She was in trouble, deep, delicious trouble. Chapter 4. The Coffee Moment. Leela hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom weight of Ethan's hand over hers. She heard the way he'd said her name, not as a command, but as an invitation. She had stared at her ceiling until 3:00 a.m., replaying the text message exchange that had ended her night. Leela, I'm home, safe and sound. Ethan, good. Rest, Leela, you've earned it. It was a simple exchange, yet she'd read those 8 words from him 100 times, searching for the subtext, feeling the heat of them in the pit of her stomach. She arrived at the office at 6:45 a.m., her body fueled by nervous adrenaline and a desperate need to prove she was still the professional, unflappable assistant he had hired. The lobby was empty, the marble floors gleaming under the dim security lights. When she reached the 42nd floor, the lights were already on, casting a golden glow over the glass partitions. She headed straight for the small, high-end kitchenette tucked behind the reception area. She needed caffeine. She needed a shield. She didn't expect to find him there. Ethan was leaning against the granite countertop, a heavy ceramic mug in his hand. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket or his vest. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked rugged, tired, and devastatingly handsome in the soft morning light. The steam from the espresso machine hissed, filling the small space with the rich, dark scent of roasted beans. You're early again, he said. His voice was deeper in the morning, a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. I could say the same for you, sir, Leela replied, stepping into the room. The space felt suddenly much smaller. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and the lingering scent of his sandalwood cologne. I didn't leave, he said simply. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. The Cayman's report needed a final sweep. I stayed to finish it. Leela felt a pang of guilt. I should have stayed. That was my job. It was late, Leela, and I find I work better in the silence of the night. He set his mug down and turned to the machine. I took the liberty of making yours. Flat white, 2 sugars, if I remember your order from the first day correctly. Leela blinked, surprised. You remembered my coffee order. I remember everything, Leela, he murmured. He picked up the second cup and moved toward her. He didn't stop until he was well within her personal bubble. He held the cup out, but as Leela reached for it, he didn't let go immediately. Their fingers brushed, the pads of his fingers sliding against her knuckles. It wasn't a quick, accidental touch. It was slow. Deliberate, Leela's breath hitched. She looked up, trapped by the intensity in his blue eyes. There was no boss mask this morning. There was only the raw, unfiltered hunger she'd glimpsed the night before. It's hot, he warned, his voice a mere whisper. I like it hot, she stammered, then immediately blushed at the double entendre she hadn't intended. A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips, a slow, wicked curve. Do you now? He let go of the cup, but he didn't move away. He stayed close, his presence a heavy, warm weight. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. Leela felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird wanting to escape. "You have a bit of." He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, his thumb brushed the corner of her lower lip. The contact was electric. His skin was warm, slightly rough, and the sensation of him touching her mouth sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated desire straight to her core. He didn't pull away. He let his thumb linger, tracing the curve of her lip, his gaze dropping to watch the movement. "Milk foam," he lied softly. There was no foam. They both knew it. Leela's tongue darted out instinctively to touch the spot he was rubbing, and her tip grazed the pad of his thumb. The world seemed to stop. Ethan's pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a growl of restraint. "Leela," he warned, his voice thick with a sudden, heavy tension. "Yes," she breathed, "you are playing a very dangerous game." "I'm not playing," she whispered, the honesty of it surprising even her. Ethan leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could feel the heat of his skin, the rhythm of his breathing. The scent of him was everywhere. It was all she could process. Every instinct in her body was screaming for him to close the distance, to crush his lips against hers, to end the agonizing tension that had been building since the moment they met. "If I kiss you," Ethan said, his voice raw and ragged, "there is no going back. I don't do things halfway. If you're mine in every way. Do you understand that?" Leela's head spun. The word mine echoed in her mind, possessive and dark. She should run. She should put the coffee down and walk out of the building. This was her career, her reputation, her future. But then Ethan's hand moved from her lip to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the loose strands of hair that had escaped her bun. He tilted her head back, forcing her to look at him. "Say yes, Leela," he commanded, though it sounded like a plea. "Tell me to stop or say yes." The air was screaming with the unspoken. The quiet of the morning office felt like a sanctuary, a place where the rules of the world didn't apply. Leela opened her mouth to speak, her heart in her throat. Ding! The sound of the elevator chime echoed through the hallway, followed by the muffled sound of laughter and footsteps. The morning shift was arriving. The spell shattered. Ethan pulled back instantly, his hand dropping from her neck. In a heartbeat, the CEO was back. He picked up his mug, his expression hardening into a mask of professional indifference, though his breathing was still slightly labored. Leela turned toward the counter, her hands shaking so badly she had to set her coffee down before she spilled it. "Mr. Miller," a voice called out. It was Marcus from HR, walking past the kitchenette. "You're in early." "Always, Marcus," Ethan replied, his voice cool and steady, as if he hadn't just been seconds away from devouring his assistant. "Leela and I were just reviewing the schedule for the day. We have a lot to get through." Marcus nodded and kept walking. Leela finally risked a glance at Ethan. He was looking at her, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. His eyes promised that this wasn't over. That the yes she hadn't had the chance to say was only being deferred. "Get to your desk, Miss Vance," he said, the formality of her name feeling like a cold splash of water. "I want the morning briefings in 5 minutes." "Yes, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice trembling. As she walked out of the kitchenette, her legs felt like lead. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his thumb on her lip. The coffee in her hand was forgotten, the heat of the cup pale in comparison to the fire he had started in her blood. The flirtation had escalated. The boundaries were blurring. And as Leela sat down at her desk, she knew one thing for certain. she wasn't going to tell him to stop. Chapter 5, Office Gossip. The air in the 42nd floor executive suite was usually thin, crisp, and filtered to perfection. But by Thursday morning, Leela felt like she was breathing in smoke. It started with the eyes. When she walked toward the communal printer to retrieve the morning's risk assessment reports, she felt the weight of stares. It wasn't the usual new girl curiosity she'd experienced in her first week. This was different. It was sharp. It was calculated. Sarah, a senior coordinator from the marketing department with a penchant for expensive silk scarves and even more expensive secrets, was standing by the water cooler. She didn't look away when Leela approached. Instead, she offered a slow, feline smile. "Late night on Tuesday, wasn't it, Leela?" Sarah asked, her voice light but laced with a subtle venom. Leela kept her eyes on the printer tray. "The Jones acquisition required extra hours. We all put in the work, Sarah." "Oh, I'm sure," Sarah purred, stepping closer. The scent of her floral perfume was cloying. "But I don't think the all included the junior analysts after 9 o'clock. Marcus said the lights were still on in the inner sanctum until nearly midnight. And then again, so early yesterday morning in the break room, you and Mr. Miller seemed to be very synchronized." Leela's heart did a nervous skip step. She remembered the way Ethan's thumb had grazed her lip only 24 hours ago. She remembered the heat of his breath, the promise in his eyes. Did someone see? The kitchenette wasn't exactly a private bunker. "Mr. Miller expects excellence," Leela said, her voice sounding steadier than she felt. "And excellence doesn't keep bankers' hours." "Just be careful, honey," Sarah whispered, leaning in so close Leela could see the perfect application of her eyeliner. "Ethan Miller doesn't do office romances. He does disposable assets. The last girl who thought she was special ended up with a very generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement that keeps her from even saying his name in her sleep. It would be a shame to see such a thorough assistant lose her desk." Sarah patted Leela's arm, a touch that felt like a warning, and sauntered away. Leela stood frozen by the printer, her face burned. The flattery of being noticed was quickly being curdled by the reality of corporate politics. In this building, reputation was everything. If the rumor mill started grinding, it wouldn't matter how good she was at finance or how many languages she spoke. She would be the girl who slept her way to the 42nd floor. She grabbed her papers and hurried back to her desk, her head down. The day didn't get easier. Every time Ethan buzzed her, every time she entered his office, she felt the eyes of the floor tracking her movement through the glass partitions. She felt hyper-aware of how long she stayed inside, of how close she stood to his desk, of the way she smoothed her skirt before entering. At 11:00 a.m., Ethan called a snap meeting for the senior heads. Leela sat in her usual spot, just behind and to the left of Ethan. He was in peak boss mode, sharp, ruthless, and entirely composed. He was wearing a charcoal suit today with a pale lavender shirt that made his eyes look like chips of ice. As the head of sales presented his quarterly projections, Ethan leaned back in his chair. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the table, his fingers steepled. Then, as if he couldn't help himself, his gaze drifted. He looked at Leela. It was a split second, a heartbeat. But in that look, there was a world of unspoken things. His eyes dropped to her mouth, lingering just long enough for the memory of his touch to flare between them like a match in a dark room. Leela felt her breath hitch. She looked down at her tablet, her fingers trembling as she typed a note that made no sense. "Is there a problem, Miss Vance?" The voice was Ethan S. It was loud, professional, and directed right at her. The entire table turned to look at her. Sarah, sitting across the room, arched a perfectly groomed eyebrow. Leela looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze. He looked perfectly composed, but she saw the slight tension in his jaw. He was testing her, or perhaps he was protecting her by being intentionally cold in front of the others. "No, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice clear. "I was just noting the discrepancy in the Q3 projections that Mr. Henderson mentioned." "Good," Ethan said, his voice clipped. "Keep focused. I don't pay you to daydream." The meeting continued, but the damage was done. The reprimand felt staged, a performance for the benefit of the prying eyes in the room. But to the rest of the staff, it was just more fuel for the fire. Why was he looking at her so intently? Why is he so hard on her? Is it because they're fighting? Is it because they're something else? Lunch was a lonely affair. Leela usually ate at her desk, but today she felt the need to escape. She found a small, quiet park 2 blocks away, sitting on a concrete bench while the city roared around her. She thought about Sarah's warning, disposable assets. Was that what she was? A distraction? A game for a man who had everything and wanted to see if he could break the one person who said she wouldn't. Her phone buzzed in her lap. It was a calendar invite for 4:00 p.m. Meeting Vance Miller, private office. Topic: performance review. Her stomach dropped. Performance reviews weren't scheduled for another 3 months. When she returned to the office, the atmosphere was even more stifling. The whispers seemed to follow her down the hall. In the elevator, 2 women from accounting stopped talking the moment she stepped inside, exchanging a look that said more than words ever could. By 3:59 p.m., Leela was a nervous wreck. She stood outside the oak doors, took 3 deep breaths, and knocked. "Come in." Ethan was sitting at his desk, the blinds partially tilted to let in the late afternoon sun. The light hit the mahogany, making the room feel warm and golden. "Sit down, Leela," he said, not looking up from his laptop. She sat in the leather chair opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He closed the laptop and looked at her. He didn't look like a man about to give a performance review. He looked like a man who was tired of pretending. "The office is talking," he said bluntly. Leela's heart hammered. "I know. Sarah from marketing has been making rounds. She's a gossip, but she's a gossip with a loud voice. She's telling people I've been giving you preferential treatment. I told her the Jones acquisition required the hours, sir. I've done nothing to warrant those rumors." Ethan stood up and walked around the desk. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. He leaned back against the desk, his long legs nearly touching her knees. "I know you haven't," he said, his voice softening. "But they're right about one thing." Leela looked up at him. "What?" "I am giving you preferential treatment. In my head." He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder before he drew it back, as if fighting himself. "I can't stop thinking about you, Leela. In meetings, in my car, when I'm trying to sleep. The rumors are a nuisance, but the reality is a catastrophe." Leela felt a rush of heat. "Ethan, we can't, the office," Sarah said. "I don't care what Sarah says," Ethan growled, leaning down so their faces were level. "But I care about your reputation. I won't have them dragging your name through the mud because I can't keep my hands off you." "Then stop," Leela whispered, though she didn't mean it. Ethan's eyes darkened. "Is that what you want? You want me to stop?" He leaned in closer. The scent of him, the sandalwood, the leather, the power, wrapped around her like a blanket. He was so close she could see the pulse jumping in his neck. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm a man of my word, Leela," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. I told you yesterday that if I kiss you, there's no going back. The rumors out there, they're just noise, but what's happening in this room, this is real. He reached out and finally touched her. It wasn't a tentative touch. He cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheekbone with a possessive intensity. "Let them talk," he whispered. "Let them wonder, because they have no idea how much I want to ruin you for any other man." Leela's breath hitched. The embarrassment she'd felt all day vanished, replaced by a fierce, burning pride. She was the one he wanted. Not Sarah, not the junior analysts, not the disposable assets of the past. "Ethan," she breathed. A sudden knock on the door made them bolt apart. "Mr. Miller." It was Marcus from HR. "The legal team is here for the 4:15. Ethan straightened his tie, his expression instantly transforming back into the cold, unyielding CEO. "Send them in, Marcus." He looked at Leela, a silent command in his eyes. "Stay strong." "That will be all, Miss Vance," he said, his voice formal. "Ensure those files are ready for the morning." "Yes, Mr. Miller," Leela said, her voice steady. As she walked past the legal team in the hallway, she didn't lower her head. She didn't look away from the curious glances. She felt Ethan's touch still lingering on her skin like a brand. The gossip was just noise, but the fire was just beginning. Chapter 6. The First Accident. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the threat of rain. For Leela, the atmosphere inside Miller Enterprises felt just as volatile. After the performance review that had nearly ended in a scandal-worthy kiss, Leela had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom pressure of Ethan's hand on her jaw. She felt the weight of his words, "Ruin you for any other man." It was a terrifying, exhilarating promise that made her career goals feel increasingly like a secondary concern. She was determined to be the perfect assistant today. No blushing, no stammering, and definitely no accidental lingering. She had dressed in a high-collared navy dress, a suit of armor designed to keep her contained and professional. By 10:00 a.m., the office was a hive of activity. The Tokyo merger was hitting a critical phase, and Ethan was in a state of high-octane focus. He had been on the phone with international bankers since 6:00 a.m., his voice a low, rhythmic growl that she could hear through the heavy oak doors. "Leela." "My office. Now, and bring the physical files for the sterling assets," Ethan barked through the intercom. Leela grabbed the thick folders and, as an afterthought, picked up the fresh espresso she had just prepared for him. She knew he took it black, scorching hot, and at exactly this time every morning. She balanced the files in her left arm and the steaming ceramic cup in her right hand. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, her mind racing through the bullet points of the sterling account. Ethan was standing behind his desk, leaning over a spread of architectural blueprints. His jacket was off, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and his tie was pulled loose. He looked like a man in the middle of a storm, and even in his agitation, he was the most magnetic thing she'd ever seen. "I have the files, Mr. Miller," she said, stepping toward the desk. "Finally, put them here," he said, gesturing to a small clearing among the blueprints. He didn't look up, his eyes scanning the technical drawings. "I also need you to call the lead architect. Tell him if he doesn't revise the square footage on the atrium, I'll find someone who can." Leela moved to set the files down, but as she leaned over the desk, the edge of the heavy folder caught on the corner of his laptop. It jerked her arm. Time seemed to slow down. The espresso cup tilted. Leela's heart lurched into her throat. She tried to write it, but her fingers slipped on the smooth ceramic. Splash! The dark, steaming liquid erupted from the cup, painting a jagged, obsidian streak across the blueprints and, worse, spraying directly across the front of Ethan's pristine white dress shirt. Leela gasped, the cup clattering onto the marble desk with a hollow thud. "Oh my God. Ethan, Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry." Ethan froze. He looked down at his chest, where the hot liquid was already soaking into the expensive cotton, turning it translucent and sticking it to the hard planes of his torso. He let out a low, hissed breath. "Leela," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm so sorry, let me." Panic took over. Leela grabbed a handful of silk napkins from the catering tray on the side table and lunged toward him. She began dabbing frantically at his chest, her hands trembling. She wasn't thinking about boundaries or HR or the rumors. She was only thinking about the heat of the coffee and the damage to his shirt. "I'm so clumsy. I don't know how. I'll get this out. I have a Tide pen in my desk." Her hand was moving rapidly over his chest, pressing the napkins against the damp fabric. She could feel the heat of his skin beneath the shirt, the hard, defined ridges of his pectoral muscles. Her knuckles brushed against his warm skin where the buttons were undone. Suddenly, a large, warm hand clamped around her wrist, stopping her mid-stroke. Leela froze. She looked up. Ethan was looking down at her, his jaw set, his eyes dark with an unreadable intensity. The air between them, already thin, seemed to vanish entirely. "Leela," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that she felt in her fingertips. "You're making it worse." I'm trying to help," she stammered, her face flushing a deep, hot crimson. She tried to pull her hand back, but his grip was firm. Not painful, but absolute. "Are you?" Ethan stepped closer, forcing her to take a half step back until her calves hit the edge of his desk. "Because right now, you're rubbing my chest in a very closed office, and the coffee is the last thing I'm thinking about." Leela's breath hitched. She looked down at where her hand was still pressed against his heart. She could feel it beating, fast and heavy, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. The white fabric of his shirt was now transparent where it was wet, revealing the dark hair of his chest and the tanned skin she'd only dreamed of touching. Ethan reached out with his free hand, his fingers grazing her chin and tilting her head back so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You're shaking," he murmured. I'm upset. I ruined your shirt. It's probably silk blend." "It's just a shirt, Leela," he said, his voice dropping to that gravelly, intimate register that made her knees feel like they were made of smoke. He let go of her wrist, but only to slide his hand up her arm, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin of her inner elbow. "But your focus, that's a different story. You've been distracted all morning. Is it because of what I said yesterday?" Leela swallowed hard. "I'm trying to be professional, Mr. Miller." "You're failing," he teased. A slow, wicked smirk touched his lips. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of the spilled coffee mixed with his sandalwood cologne, creating an intoxicating, earthy aroma. "In fact, I think this accident might be a Freudian slip. Did you want an excuse to touch me, Miss Vance?" Leela's eyes widened. "No, I mean no, sir. It was an accident." "A very convenient one," he whispered. He took the napkins from her limp hand and tossed them onto the desk without looking. Then he leaned down, his lips ghosting over the shell of her ear. "The coffee is hot, Leela, but you're burning me up." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. His hand moved to her waist, his fingers digging slightly into the fabric of her navy dress, pulling her an inch closer. The contact was electric. She could feel the dampness of his shirt against her own chest, the heat of the spill a lingering warmth between them. "What am I going to do with you?" he asked, his voice raw. "Fire me." She whispered, though the word felt ridiculous. Ethan let out a short, dark laugh. Fire you. I can barely let you leave the room. No, Leela, I think I'm going to make you stay late. We need to clean up this mess. He didn't mean the coffee. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a heartbeat, the world was silent. The first accident had stripped away the last of their professional pretenses. They were standing in a puddle of espresso and ruined blueprints, but all Leela could feel was the possessive weight of his hands and the undeniable gravity of his desire. Go get your Tide pen, Leela, Ethan said, his voice returning to a mock professional clip, though his eyes remained dark. And when you come back, lock the door. I don't want anyone seeing me in this state. Leela nodded, her head spinning. She turned and practically ran for the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she reached the safety of her desk, she pressed her cool hands to her burning cheeks. She looked down at her fingers. They were stained with a little bit of coffee, and they were still trembling. She wasn't just his assistant anymore. She was the spark in his powder keg. And as she reached into her drawer for the stain remover, she knew she wasn't just going back in there to fix a shirt. She was going back to surrender. Chapter 7, The Confession. Leela stood outside the heavy oak doors, her fingers curled tightly around the small white plastic tube of the stain remover. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. Lock the door, he had said. That single instruction carried more weight than a 1,000-page merger. It was an invitation to a space where the rules of Miller Enterprises, and perhaps the rules of her own self-preservation, no longer applied. She took a breath, the cool air of the hallway doing nothing to soothe the fire in her cheeks, and pushed the door open. The office was bathed in the amber glow of a dying sun. The shadows were long, stretching across the mahogany and marble like dark fingers. Ethan was standing by the window, his back to her. He had removed his tie and tossed it onto a chair. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, the damp, stained fabric clinging to the hard lines of his body. The sound of the door clicking shut and the turn of the deadbolt echoed in the silent room. Ethan didn't turn around immediately. You're back. I have the pen, Leela said, her voice sounding small. He turned then. In the dim light, he looked less like a corporate titan and more like something ancient and predatory. He didn't say a word, he simply waited as she approached. Leela felt the familiar gravity of him pulling her in. She stopped in front of him, her hands trembling as she uncapped the stain remover. She didn't look at his eyes, she couldn't. Instead, she focused on the dark brown splash across the white cotton of his shirt. I need you to hold still, she whispered. I'm not the one shaking, Leela, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the air and settle in her marrow. She stepped into his space. The scent of him, sandalwood, espresso, and the salt of his skin wrapped around her. She began to work the tip of the pen into the fabric, her knuckles occasionally brushing against the warm, firm skin of his chest. Every touch was a lightning strike. She could feel the heat of him, the steady, powerful thrum of his heart beneath her hand. As she worked, she became aware of his gaze. He wasn't looking at the stain, he was looking at her. Leela, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I almost have it, she said, her voice hitching. If I can just get the pigment to lift. Forget the shirt. His hand came up, his fingers wrapping around hers, stopping the movement of the pen. He didn't pull her hand away, he held it against his chest, right over his heart. Through the thin, damp cotton, she could feel the muscle jumping. Look at me, he commanded. It wasn't the voice of a boss. It was the voice of a man who was losing a battle with himself. Leela looked up. His eyes were no longer the cold blue of a winter sea. They were dark, turbulent, and filled with a raw, aching honesty that stripped her bare. I didn't hire you for this, he said, his voice raw. I hired an assistant. I hired someone to organize my life, not to dismantle it. I'm just doing my job, Ethan, she whispered, her name for him feeling like a prayer. No, you aren't. You're standing there, looking at me with those eyes, and you're making me forget every rule I've ever made for myself. He stepped closer, forcing her to tilt her head back. His free hand moved to her waist, his thumb hooking into the belt of her dress, drawing her flush against him. I haven't been able to think about a single contract for 3 days. I look at a spreadsheet, and I see the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. I walk into a boardroom, and all I want to do is tell everyone to leave so I can have you to myself. Leela's breath caught. Ethan, we can't. The rumors, my career. Do you think I don't know the risks? He growled, his face inches from hers. I've spent my whole life building this kingdom. I know exactly what a scandal would do. I know what it would do to you. That's why I've been trying to stay away. That's why I've been a bastard to you all week. You were protecting me. I was trying to protect myself, he confessed, a self-deprecating smirk touching his lips. I thought if I was hard enough on you, if I pushed you enough, you'd de-quit. You'd leave, and I could go back to my cold, quiet life where I was in control of everything. He let go of her hand and cupped her face, his palms warm and slightly rough against her skin. But you didn't quit, he whispered. You stood your ground, you challenged me, and every time you did, I fell a little deeper. I don't just want an assistant, Leela. I don't even want a fling. I want you, in my bed, in my life, in my head. I want everything you're willing to give, and a lot of things you probably shouldn't. The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. It was the thing she had been both fearing and craving since the moment she walked into this office. Leela felt the conflict tearing at her. She had worked so hard to get here. She wanted to be a CEO one day, to be the one making the power moves. If she gave in to this, she was risking it all. She would be the cliché, the girl who fell for the boss. But as she looked at Ethan, she realized the truth. The professionalism was a mask. The ambition was a goal. But this was alive. I've been trying to stay away too, she admitted, her voice trembling. I told myself you were just a distraction, a powerful man who liked to play games. I told myself I was too smart to fall for someone like you. And, Ethan asked, his gaze burning into hers. And I'm not as smart as I thought, she whispered. Because every time you walk into a room, the air disappears. Every time you touch me, I forget my own name. Ethan's grip on her jaw tightened, not in anger, but in a surge of possessive desire. Then tell me to stop, Leela. Right now. Tell me you want to keep this strictly professional, and I will never touch you like this again. I will be the boss you hired. I will be cold, and I will be distant, and I will let you build your career without me in your way. He paused, his breathing heavy. But if you don't tell me to stop, if you stay in this room right now, there is no going back. I won't let you go. I will make you mine, and I don't care who sees or what they say. Leela looked at the door. The lock was turned. The world outside, the gossip, the career ladders, the safety of her old life felt like a distant, fading memory. Then she looked back at Ethan. She saw the man behind the suit. She saw the vulnerability he only showed to her. She saw the fire she had started. "Don't stop," she whispered. The words were barely a breath, but in the silence of the office, they sounded like a thunderclap. Ethan didn't hesitate. He let out a low, guttural sound and crushed his lips against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the release of a week's worth of tension, of unspoken words, and of forbidden desire. He tasted like coffee and hunger. His tongue swept into her mouth, claiming her with a ferocity that made her head spin. Leela groaned into his mouth, her hands flying up to tangle in his dark hair, pulling him closer. She wanted to be consumed. She wanted to vanish into him. The stain on his shirt didn't matter. The blueprints on the desk didn't matter. For the first time in her life, Leela Vance wasn't thinking about the next step. She was exactly where she wanted to be. The confession was over. The surrender had begun. Chapter 8, The First Kiss. The world outside the oak doors ceased to exist. The hum of the city, the distant sirens of Manhattan, the clicking of keyboards in the outer office. It all fell away, replaced by the thundering roar of Leela's own pulse. When Ethan's lips finally met hers, it wasn't the tentative, exploratory brush she had imagined in her late-night fantasies. It was an explosion. It was the sound of a levee breaking after a lifetime of holding back the flood. His mouth was hot, demanding, and tasted faintly of the dark espresso she'd spilled only an hour before. He didn't just kiss her, he claimed her. One of his hands remained buried in the hair at the base of her neck, his fingers tangling in the dark strands and tilting her head back to find the perfect angle. His other hand was splayed across the small of her back, crushing her against the hard, unyielding lines of his body. Leela let out a soft, broken sound, half sob, half moan, and her hands, which had been trembling only moments ago, found their purpose. She gripped the damp, stained fabric of his shirt, her nails digging into the muscular breadth of his shoulders. She wanted to be closer. She wanted to crawl under his skin. Ethan groaned, a low vibration in his chest that she felt against her own ribs. He backed her up, his movements fluid and predatory, until the backs of her thighs hit the cold, hard edge of his black marble desk. He didn't stop. He leaned into her, his weight pressing her down onto the surface. The contrast was staggering, the icy, polished stone beneath her and the furnace-like heat of the man above her. He pulled back for a fraction of a second, his breath hitching as he looked at her. His eyes were no longer the piercing blue of a CEO. They were dark, blown wide with a hunger that was almost frightening. His lips were wet, swollen from the force of their collision. "Leela," he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Tell me to stop now, because if I don't stop, I'm taking everything." Leela's head was spinning. Her lungs felt like they were filled with smoke. She looked up at him, at the man who held her career, her reputation, and now her heart in his calloused hands. She saw the desperation in him, the same desperation that was clawing at her insides. "Don't you dare stop," she whispered. Ethan let out a sound that was almost a growl. He grabbed her waist and hoisted her onto the desk, clearing a space with a sweeping motion of his arm that sent a stack of folders and a silver pen set clattering to the floor. The noise was loud in the silent office, a sharp reminder of the professional world they were currently desecrating, but neither of them cared. He stepped between her knees, his hands sliding up her thighs, bunching the fabric of her navy dress. The touch of his palms against her skin was electric. It was the first time he had touched her without the barrier of clothing, and the sensation was so intense Leela had to close her eyes, her head falling back. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She opened her eyes. He was watching her with a terrifying focus. He reached out, his thumb tracing her lower lip, which was bruised and red from his kiss. "This is the end of the line, Leela," he murmured. "Once we do this, I'm not just your boss. And you're not just my assistant. You're mine. Do you understand? I don't share what's mine. I don't let go of what's mine." "I'm not asking you to let go," she replied, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. He kissed her again, but this time it was different. It was slower, deeper, a lingering promise of what was to come. His tongue swept against hers, a rhythmic, intoxicating dance that made her toes curl. He moved his hands to her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones as he poured every ounce of his unspoken desire into the kiss. It was forbidden. It was reckless. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. And yet, as Leela wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him closer, she had never felt more alive. The first-day girl who was worried about commas and coffee orders was gone. In her place was a woman who had finally found the fire she had been looking for. Ethan broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers. They were both gasping for air, the oxygen in the room seemingly spent. The shadows in the office had grown longer, the sun finally dipping below the horizon, leaving them in a world of twilight and secrets. He trailed his lips down her jawline, his stubble grazing her sensitive skin, and settled in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, as if memorizing her scent. "You're going to be the ruin of me, Leela Vance," he whispered against her skin. "Then we'll go down together," she whispered back. He pulled back, a ghost of a smile, a real, genuine smile touching his lips. It transformed his face, stripping away the cold mask of the tycoon and revealing the man underneath. He reached down and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The silence of the office settled around them again, but it was no longer heavy with tension. It was heavy with anticipation. They had crossed the Rubicon. The first kiss was over, but the journey was just beginning. Ethan stood up straight, though he didn't move out from between her legs. He smoothed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch now incredibly gentle. "Fix your dress," he said, his voice returning to a low, commanding rumble, though his eyes remained warm. "And I'll fix my shirt. We have 10 minutes before the night cleaning crew hits this floor." The reality of their situation rushed back in the locks, the rumors, the dangerous game they were playing. Leela slid off the desk, her legs feeling like jelly. She smoothed her skirt, her hands still trembling, while Ethan turned to the mirror on the wall to rebutton his ruined shirt. He caught her eye in the reflection. "Tonight was just the beginning, Leela. Go home, I'll call you." Leela nodded, her heart still racing. She gathered her things, her mind a blur of heat and marble and the taste of him. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back. Ethan was standing by his desk, looking like the powerful, untouchable CEO again. But he was looking at the spot on the desk where she had just been sitting. She turned the lock, stepped out into the hallway, and began the long walk to the elevators. She felt different. She walked differently. She was a woman with a secret that was currently burning a hole in her heart. The first kiss was a memory now, but its echo was louder than anything else in the city. Chapter 9: Forbidden Desire. The weekend had been a fever dream. Leela had spent 48 hours pacing her small apartment, the ghost of Ethan's lips still searing her skin. She had tried to be productive, laundry, grocery shopping, even starting a spreadsheet for her personal taxes, but her mind was a traitor. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back on that black marble desk, the cold stone against her thighs and the furnace of Ethan Miller's body pressing her down. Now, it was Monday morning. The sun was sharp and unforgiving, glinting off the steel towers of the financial district. Leela stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying a shade of lipstick that was a fraction more daring than her usual professional nude. "Boundaries," she told her reflection. "You need boundaries. He is the CEO. You are the assistant. If this continues, you lose everything you've worked for." But even as she said the words, her heart gave a traitorous thud. She didn't want boundaries. She wanted him. When she stepped onto the 42nd floor, the atmosphere felt different. Or perhaps she was the one who was different. She walked past the rows of glass-walled cubicles, feeling like a spy in enemy territory. Every good morning from a colleague felt like an interrogation. Every glance felt like a question. Ethan wasn't in yet. His office was dark, the heavy oak doors closed tight. Leela sat at her desk and tried to lose herself in the deluge of emails that had accumulated over the weekend. At 9:15 a.m., the elevator doors slid open. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. She felt him. The air in the room seemed to displace, the atmospheric pressure shifting as Ethan Miller strode down the hallway. He was wearing a charcoal three-piece suit today, looking every bit the untouchable monarch. He didn't stop at her desk. He didn't even slow down. "My office, Leela, 10 minutes. Bring the Benson file," he barked, his voice cold and clipped. Leela felt a sharp pang of disappointment. Had he regretted it? Was the first kiss just a momentary lapse in judgment for him? She gathered the files, her hands cold. She spent the next 10 minutes overanalyzing every syllable of his command. When she entered his office, he was sitting behind his desk, his eyes fixed on a glowing monitor. The blinds were open today, filling the room with a harsh, bright light that left no room for the shadows of Friday night. "The Benson file, sir," she said, placing it on the desk. She kept her distance, standing at the edge of the rug. Ethan didn't look up. "There's a discrepancy in the Q4 projections for the Benson merger. I need you to go through the raw data and find where the leak is. I want a full report by lunch." "Yes, Mr. Miller." She turned to leave, her heart heavy. She had reached the door when his voice stopped her. "Leela." She turned back. He was looking at her now. The CEO mask was still in place, but his eyes were the color of a storm at sea. He stood up slowly, walking around the desk. The movement was predatory, intentional. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow falling over her. "Close the door," he whispered. Leela reached back and pushed the door shut. The click of the latch sounded like a starting gun. Ethan didn't touch her. Not yet. He simply stood there, his presence a heavy, intoxicating weight. "Did you sleep this weekend?" "Not much," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Neither did I," he reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was light, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. "I spent 48 hours trying to convince myself that Friday was a mistake. I told myself that I was going to come in here today and treat you like any other employee. I was going to be the professional, distant boss you deserve." And Leela breathed. Ethan let out a low, dark chuckle. "And then I saw you walk past the glass this morning. I saw the way that dress fits you, the way you carry yourself like you own the floor, and I realized I'm a liar." He stepped closer, his chest nearly brushing hers. The scent of him, that sandalwood and expensive leather, hit her like a physical blow. "We have to stop," Leela said, though her hands were already finding their way to the lapels of his vest. "Ethan, the rumors are already bad, if we're caught. Your reputation might survive it, but mine won't. I'll be that girl. I'll never be a CEO. I'll just be a footnote in your biography." "I know," Ethan whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. He looked genuinely pained. "I know the cost. I've spent my whole life being the man who weighs the cost of everything. But when it comes to you, the math doesn't work. I want you more than I want my own success. Does that scare you?" "Yes," she whispered. "It scares me because I feel the same way." The admission was a surrender. Ethan's restraint snapped. He grabbed her waist, pulling her flush against him, his hands possessive and hard. He didn't kiss her. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You're an addiction, Leela," he growled against her skin. "I try to keep the boundaries. I try to be the man they expect me to be. But when you're in the room, the walls just dissolve." Leela leaned her head back, her eyes fluttering shut. She felt the conflict tearing at her soul. Every professional instinct she possessed was screaming at her to push him away, to walk out and preserve her dignity. But her body was screaming louder. "We have the Benson report," she reminded him, her voice weak. "To hell with the Benson report," he muttered, his lips trailing fire up her jawline. He moved his hands lower, his fingers digging into the curve of her hips. The desire between them was no longer a spark, it was a conflagration. It was forbidden in the truest sense, a love that could destroy them both, and yet was too powerful to extinguish. They stood there in the center of the office, two people who had everything to lose, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. "Leela," Ethan said, pulling back just enough to look her in the eye. His expression was dead serious. "The company retreat is this weekend. It's at the estate in the Hamptons. Most of the staff will be there, but the house is huge. There are places where no one goes, places where we can be alone." Leela's heart hammered. A retreat. Public eyes by day, private passion by night. It was the ultimate risk. "Is that a good idea?" she asked. "It's a terrible idea," Ethan replied, a slow, wicked smirk spreading across his face. "It's reckless, unprofessional, and potentially scandalous." He leaned in, his lips ghosting over hers. "Are you coming?" Leela looked at him, at the man who was her boss, her mentor, and her greatest temptation. She thought about the boundaries she'd tried to set this morning. She thought about the career she wanted. Then she thought about the way his hands felt on her skin. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm coming." Ethan kissed her then, a hard, brief promise of a kiss before stepping back and smoothing his vest. In a heartbeat, the CEO was back. "Good. Get that report done by noon, Miss Vance. I don't tolerate tardiness." Leela stood there, her breath ragged, watching him walk back to his desk. The forbidden desire was no longer a secret they were keeping from each other. It was a game they were playing against the world. And as she walked out of the office to start the Benson report, she knew the stakes had just been raised. Chapter 10: Weekend Escape. The Hamptons estate was a sprawling monument to old money and modern glass. Known as the Meridian, it sat on a private bluff overlooking the Atlantic, a 3-story masterpiece of cedar, stone, and floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed to invite the ocean inside. For the 30 employees of Miller Enterprises invited to the annual strategy retreat, it was a weekend of luxury. For Layla, it felt like walking into a gilded cage where the bars were made of prying eyes. The drive out had been agonizing. She had taken the jitney with the rest of the support staff, listening to the chatter about Q4 goals and the latest office gossip, while her phone sat heavy in her pocket. She had one unread message from Ethan, sent at 5:00 a.m., room 402, North Wing. "Don't make me wait." Now, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple, Leela stood on the teak deck, a glass of chilled Chardonnay in her hand. The salty breeze whipped a stray lock of hair across her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Leela turned. It was Marcus from HR. He looked relaxed in a linen shirt, a far cry from his usual stiff corporate attire. "It's incredible," Leela said, forcing a smile. "Mr. Miller certainly knows how to host." "He bought this place after the Renault merger," Marcus said, leaning against the railing. "He says the sound of the waves helps him think. Personally, I think he just likes having a fortress where no one can reach him unless he wants them to." Marcus lowered his voice. "He's been in a mood lately." "Sharper than usual. You've been in the line of fire more than anyone, Leela. How are you holding up?" Leela felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. He's demanding, but I'm learning a lot. Just don't let him burn you out, Marcus warned kindly. He's a man who consumes everything in his path. You have no idea, Leela thought. Just then, the glass sliders opened and Ethan stepped onto the deck. The conversation around them dipped for a second, a natural reaction to his presence. He was dressed in a black polo shirt and tailored cream trousers. The casual clothes only served to emphasize how athletic he was, the breadth of his shoulders, the lean strength of his arms. His eyes scanned the crowd, authoritative and distant, until they landed on Leela. He didn't smile. He didn't even nod, but the air between them suddenly felt like it was humming with a high-voltage current. He looked away just as quickly, engaging the CFO in a conversation about interest rates, but the message had been sent. I see you. Dinner was an exercise in torture. The long, candlelit table was filled with laughter and the clinking of silverware. Leela was seated halfway down, wedged between a junior analyst and Sarah from marketing. Ethan sat at the head of the table, the undisputed king of the feast. Leela barely tasted the lobster or the prime rib. She was hyper-aware of Ethan's every move. The way his throat moved when he drank wine, the way he leaned in to listen to a guest, the way his large, tanned hand rested on the white tablecloth. Twice she caught him looking at her. The first time he was mid-sentence, but his gaze lingered on the hollow of her throat where a small diamond pendant rested. The second time she was laughing at a joke, and she found him watching her with an intensity so raw it made her breath catch. It wasn't the look of a boss. It was the look of a man who was counting the minutes until he could tear her clothes off. You're very quiet tonight, Leela, Sarah whispered, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. Missing the city already. Just tired, Leela lied. It's been a long week. Well, get some rest, Sarah said, a faint, suspicious smile on her lips. We have the sunrise hike tomorrow. Wouldn't want you to miss the view. By 11:30 p.m., the house had finally begun to settle. The last of the bourbon-soaked conversations had drifted off into the guest wings, and the only sound was the rhythmic, distant thundering of the surf against the cliffs. Leela waited in her room, a small but elegant suite in the east wing, until the clock struck midnight. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her teeth. She had changed into a silk slip dress, a deep emerald green that she knew would look black in the shadows. She threw a cashmere cardigan over her shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The north wing was the private quarters, usually reserved for the Miller family. The hallway was lined with black and white photography and lit by dim, recessed lights. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She reached room 402. She didn't knock. She turned the handle, and the door swung open. The room was vast, dominated by a king-sized bed and a wall of glass that looked out over the moonlit ocean. The only light came from the moon, casting long, silvery rectangles across the dark hardwood floor. The door clicked shut behind her, and suddenly, two strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a solid, warm chest. "You're late," Ethan's voice rumbled in her ear. Leela let out a shaky breath, leaning her head back against his shoulder. The scent of him, clean skin and expensive scotch, was the most grounding thing she'd felt all day. I had to wait for Sarah to stop patrolling the halls. I think she's suspicious. Let her be suspicious, Ethan muttered. He turned her around in his arms, his hands sliding up to cup her face. In the moonlight, his features were sharp, his eyes glowing with a feral kind of heat. I've spent the last 5 hours watching you across a table, pretending I didn't want to crawl over the mahogany and take you in front of everyone. Ethan, she breathed, her hands finding the hem of his shirt. Do you have any idea what it did to me? he asked, his voice dropping to a low, rough growl. "Seeing you in that dress, watching you smile at other men, listening to you talk like we're strangers." "We are strangers out there," she reminded him, "not in here." He kissed her then, and it was a revelation. Away from the office, away from the desks and the files and the "yes, Mr. Miller," the kiss was different. It was slower, more possessive. He tasted like the night, cool, dark, and intoxicating. He backed her toward the glass wall. Leela felt the cool surface of the window against her back, while the front of her body was seared by the heat of him. He hiked her silk dress up, his hands warm against her bare thighs. "The view!" Leela gasped, looking out at the vast, empty ocean behind her. "No one can see us, Leela," Ethan whispered, his lips trailing down to the sensitive cord of her neck. "It's just us, and I've been waiting for this since the moment I hired you." He lifted her, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist. The green silk of her dress bunched between them as he pressed her into the glass. The moon was their only witness, the tide their only soundtrack. In the office, their passion was a frantic, stolen thing driven by the fear of discovery. But here, in the quiet of the Hamptons, it was something deeper. It was a weekend escape from the roles they played. He wasn't the CEO, and she wasn't the assistant. They were just two people, caught in the gravity of an undeniable attraction. As Ethan moved with her, his forehead resting against hers, he whispered her name over and over, like a secret he was finally allowed to tell. "Leela, stay with me," he breathed. "Just for tonight, forget the office. Forget the rules." "I forgot them a long time ago," she replied, her voice breaking as she pulled him closer. The night was long, filled with the sound of the sea and the heat of their surrender. But as the first hint of gray began to touch the horizon, Leela knew the sun would bring the masks back. They would have to walk down to breakfast, sit at opposite ends of the table, and pretend that the fire hadn't happened. But for now, in the shadows of the North Wing, the escape was perfect. Chapter 11: Jealousy and Rivalry. The morning sun over the Atlantic was too bright, too cheerful for the storm brewing in Leela's chest. She sat at the long breakfast table on the patio, the salt air tangling her hair and the smell of expensive coffee and smoked salmon filling the air. To any outsider, she looked perfectly composed, the quintessential executive assistant, iPad in hand, reviewing the morning's schedule. But beneath the table, her legs felt heavy, and her skin still hummed from the memory of Ethan's hands against the glass in the North Wing only hours ago. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours. She had snuck back to her room at 4:00 a.m., her heart in her throat every time a floorboard creaked. Ethan sat at the head of the table, looking impossibly refreshed. He was wearing a light blue linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his dark hair windblown. He was deep in conversation with the head of logistics, his voice steady and authoritative. He hadn't looked at Leela once since she'd sat down. The mask was back on, and it was thicker than ever. "Leela, dear, you look like you need a triple shot of espresso," Sarah whispered from beside her, her eyes narrowed behind oversized designer sunglasses. "The North Wing is notoriously drafty, isn't it? Hard to get a good night's rest when the wind howls like that." Leela didn't flinch. "I'm just focused on the Q4 projections, Sarah. It's going to be a long day." "Oh, it certainly is," Sarah purred. She nodded toward the driveway, where a sleek, silver convertible was pulling up. "And look who's arrived to make it even more interesting. I heard she was coming, but I didn't think she'd show up for breakfast." A woman stepped out of the car, looking like she just stepped off a yacht in the French Riviera. She was tall, with honey blonde hair falling in perfect waves, and a white sundress that screamed old money. "Elena Sterling," Sarah announced, her voice dripping with interest. Her father owns Sterling Global. She and Ethan went to Harvard together. There were rumors they were engaged a few years back before the Miller-Sterling merger fell through. Leela felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Elena didn't wait to be greeted. She strode onto the patio, her heels clicking against the teak wood. When she reached the head of the table, Ethan stood up, a courtesy he hadn't extended to anyone else all morning. "Ethan," Elena said, her voice a melodious, practiced alto. "Elena, I wasn't expecting you until the afternoon session," Ethan replied. His tone was warmer than Leela had ever heard it, a smooth, familiar warmth that made Leela's blood run cold. Elena didn't just shake his hand. She stepped into his space, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his forearm and leaning in to kiss his cheek. "I couldn't wait. The city is a tomb this weekend, and I heard you were hosting the most exclusive party of the season." Leela watched, her fingers gripping her iPad so hard the screen flickered. She saw the way Ethan didn't pull away. He didn't move his arm. He smiled, a small, genuine-looking smile, at the woman who shared a history he'd never mentioned to Leela. "Sit," Ethan said, gesturing to the empty chair to his right, the chair that was technically reserved for the CFO. "Leela, get Miss Sterling a coffee. Black, isn't it, Elena?" "You remembered," Elena beamed, sliding into the seat. Leela stood up, her face burning. She felt the eyes of the entire table on her. To the staff, she was just the assistant being given an order. But to her, it felt like a slap in the face. She was the woman he had claimed against the glass only hours ago, and now she was fetching coffee for his beautiful, high-society ex-girlfriend. As she walked to the sideboard, she could hear them laughing. "Do you remember that summer in Portofino, Ethan?" Elena's voice drifted over the patio. "The yacht, the midnight swim, your father was so furious." "I remember," Ethan's low rumble replied. Leela's hands shook as she poured the coffee. She felt a sharp, piercing pain in her chest that she couldn't rationalize. It wasn't just professional jealousy. It wasn't just the fear of being replaced. It was a raw, primitive possessiveness. She realized with a terrifying jolt that she didn't just want Ethan Miller's attention. She wanted his soul. She wanted to be the only one who knew the man behind the suit. When she returned to the table and set the coffee down, Elena didn't even look at her. "Thank you, sweetie," she said dismissively, her eyes never leaving Ethan's. The afternoon was a blur of misery. The strategy session was held in the glass-walled library. Leela sat in the corner, taking minutes, while Elena sat next to Ethan, occasionally leaning over to whisper something in his ear or point at a figure on his laptop. Each time she touched him, a hand on his shoulder, a playful nudge, Leela felt like a wire was being pulled tighter and tighter inside her. Ethan remained professional, but he didn't stop her. He was the perfect host, the perfect gentleman. By the time the cocktail hour rolled around at the poolside, Leela was at her breaking point. She had changed into a simple black bikini and a sheer sarong, hoping the water would cool the fire in her blood. She stood at the edge of the infinity pool, watching Ethan and Elena. They were standing near the bar, Elena laughing at something Ethan said, her hand resting comfortably on his chest, right over his heart. The same heart Leela had felt beating against her palm in the dark. "She's gorgeous, isn't she?" Leela turned. It was Marcus again. He was holding 2 drinks, offering one to her. "She's a sterling," Leela said, her voice tight. "She's built for this world." "They look like they belong on top of a wedding cake," Marcus mused, oblivious to the war inside Leela. "Everyone thought they'd be the power couple of the decade. I wonder why it ended." Maybe he realized she was just another disposable asset, Leela snapped, then immediately regretted it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Leela, your claws are showing." Leela turned and dove into the pool. The cold water was a shock to her system, a welcome distraction from the heat of her anger. She swam laps with a frantic, aggressive energy, trying to burn off the image of Alina's hand on Ethan's shirt. When she finally climbed out, gasping for air, she found herself alone on the far side of the pool deck. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows over the estate. You swim like you're trying to escape something. Leela froze. She didn't have to turn around, she knew that voice. Ethan was standing a few feet away, a drink in his hand. He had changed into dark swim trunks and a loose white shirt, unbuttoned to reveal his chest. He looked devastating. "I'm just exercising, Mr. Miller," she said, reaching for her towel. She didn't look at him. "You've been silent all day, Leela, even for you." He stepped closer. The smell of the ocean and his cologne hit her, making her dizzy. "Is there a problem with the schedule?" Leela whirled around, her wet hair splashing droplets against his shirt. "The schedule is fine. The Sterling merger seems to be progressing perfectly. I'm sure you and Alina have plenty to discuss. Portofino, for instance." Ethan's eyes narrowed. A slow, knowing smirk touched his lips. "Are you jealous, Leela?" "I'm your assistant, Ethan. I don't have the right to be jealous." "And yet, you look like you want to drown her in the Atlantic." He stepped into her space, ignoring the fact that she was dripping wet. He reached out, his hand wrapping around her upper arm, pulling her toward him. "Alina is a business associate. Our history is exactly that history." "She was touching you," Leela whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her realization. "She was touching you like she owned you, and you let her." "I was being polite," Ethan growled, his grip tightening. "Because I have 30 employees watching my every move, because I have a reputation to maintain." "And what about my reputation?" Leela challenged, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. "I'm the one fetching coffee while your real match sits in your chair. I realized something today, Ethan. I realized I'm not just playing a game. I'm in love with you. And it's the most terrifying, miserable feeling I've ever had." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the sound of the waves. Leela's heart stopped. She hadn't meant to say it. The words had clawed their way out of her, born from the friction of jealousy and desire. Ethan's expression shifted. The smirk vanished, replaced by an intensity that made her knees buckle. He let go of her arm, only to cup her face in both hands, his thumbs stroking her wet skin. "In love with me?" he whispered. "I hate it," she sobbed, a single tear escaping. "I hate how much I want you. I hate that I have to share you with the world." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at her, his gaze searching her eyes as if looking for a way out or a way in. Then he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You don't have to share me, Leela," he rasped. "Not where it matters. Alina is nothing. The office is nothing. This." He gestured between them. "This is the only thing that's real." He kissed her then, and it wasn't the kiss of a boss or a lover. It was the kiss of a man who was being consumed by the same fire. It was desperate, raw, and tasted of salt and surrender. In that moment, the jealousy didn't vanish, but it transformed. It became the fuel for a deeper desire. Leela realized that the rivalry wasn't with Alina, it was with the world that kept them apart. "Tonight," Ethan whispered against her lips. "After everyone is asleep. My room. Don't make me come looking for you." He pulled back, his professional mask sliding back into place as he heard voices approaching from the house. He walked away without a backward glance, leaving Leela standing by the pool, her heart racing and her soul finally, irrevocably, laid bare. The jealousy had awakened the truth, and the truth was more dangerous than any rumor. Chapter 12, Steamy Texts. The Sunday morning strategy session at the Meridian was designed to be the pinnacle of professional focus. The large glass-walled boardroom was filled with the cream of Miller Enterprises' leadership. Sunlight filtered through the cedar beams, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a spread of imported fruits, artisanal pastries, and enough caffeine to power a small city. Ethan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking like a god of industry. He wore a crisp white shirt, the top button undone, and a slate-gray vest that hugged his torso. To everyone else, he was the brilliant, demanding CEO dissecting a difficult merger. To Leela, who sat 3 chairs down with her iPad ready to take minutes, he was the man who had tasted the salt on her skin by the pool and whispered that she didn't have to share him. Her phone, tucked into the pocket of her tailored navy slacks, gave a sharp, discreet buzz against her thigh. Leela stiffened. She kept her eyes on the spreadsheet being projected onto the wall, her stylus poised. She waited a beat, then another, before casually reaching into her pocket as if adjusting her position. Ethan 9:14 a.m. You're biting your lip again, Leela. Stop it. Leela's heart did a violent somersault. She didn't look up. She shouldn't. She tapped out a quick response, her thumbs flying over the glass. Leela 9:15 a.m. I'm concentrating on the logistics report, Mr. Miller. You should do the same. She put the phone back. Across the table, Elena Sterling was leaning toward Ethan, her blonde hair brushing his shoulder as she whispered a comment about the Sterling Global synergy. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable, but his hand moved beneath the table. Buzz. Ethan 9:16 a.m. The logistics report is boring, and the way that silk blouse clings to you is far more interesting. I can see the outline of your lace through the fabric when the light hits you just right. Leela felt a flush of heat creep up her neck, spreading across her chest. She risked a glance. Ethan was looking at a printout, his face a mask of bored professionalism. If she hadn't felt the vibration of the text, she would have sworn he was a saint. Leela 9:17 a.m. That is highly inappropriate for a strategy session. Do I need to report you to HR? Marcus is sitting right next to you. Ethan 9:18 a.m. Marcus is thinking about the golf course. I'm thinking about the way you looked last night by the pool. Wet. Shaking, telling me you love me. Leela's breath hitched. She accidentally dragged her stylus across the iPad, creating a jagged black line across the meeting notes. She quickly erased it, her face burning. The word love hung between them in the digital ether, a live wire that could electrocute them both. Leela 9:20 a.m. You shouldn't say that here. Someone might see. Ethan 9:21 a.m. Let them. Let them see how much I want to take you into that library behind us, lock the door, and remind you who you belong to. I want to see if you make those same sounds when I have you against the bookshelves. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees hotter. Leela felt a familiar, heavy ache beginning to throb in her lower belly. She adjusted her legs, the friction of her trousers against her skin feeling like a provocation. She looked up and found Ethan watching her. He wasn't smiling. He looked almost angry, his jaw set, his blue eyes dark with a suppressed violence of desire. He reached out and picked up his glass of water, his knuckles white. Leela 9:23 a.m. You're a dangerous man, Ethan Miller. Ethan 9:24 a.m. And you're a cruel woman, Leela Vance, sending me messages while you sit there looking like a prim, perfect assistant. If you knew what I was picturing doing to you right now, you wouldn't be able to finish those notes. Leela felt a surge of boldness. The jealousy from the day before had been replaced by a heady, intoxicating sense of power. She knew something Alina Sterling didn't. She knew what it was like to have Ethan Miller's total, undivided obsession. She waited until Alina leaned in again to show Ethan a graph on her phone. Leela took a photo of her own lap, just the edge of her navy slacks and the hem of her silk blouse where it tucked into her waist, and sent it. Leela 9:26 a.m. Is this what you're picturing? She saw Ethan's phone light up on the table. He didn't pick it up immediately. He finished his conversation with Alina, his voice steady, his eyes never wavering. But then, as Alina turned to speak to the CFO, he glanced down. Leela saw his throat move as he swallowed. His hand tightened on his silver pen until she thought it might snap. Ethan 9:28 a.m. Tonight, the North Wing, don't even think about wearing underwear. I want nothing between my skin and yours. Leela's phone buzzed again, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking too much. She tucked the device away and forced herself to look at the projection screen, though the numbers were nothing but a blur of light. The meeting dragged on for another hour. To the rest of the world, it was a productive Sunday morning session. To Leela and Ethan, it was a prolonged exercise in foreplay. The silence between them was louder than the voices of 30 executives. When the meeting finally adjourned, the room erupted into a flurry of movement. People stood up, stretching, heading for the lunch buffet on the deck. Leela gathered her things, keeping her head down. She felt a presence behind her, a heavy, warm shadow. "Miss Vance," Ethan's voice was like velvet-wrapped steel. Leela turned. He was standing close, too close for a public room. He held out a stray folder she'd forgotten. "You missed this," he said. As she took the folder, his fingers brushed hers. It wasn't a quick touch. He gripped her hand for a split second, his thumb digging into her palm in a silent, possessive command. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her heart hammering. "See that the Q4 summaries are finished by 5, he said, his eyes promising 1,000 things that had nothing to do with summaries. "I want everything in order before we return to the city." "Yes, Mr. Miller." As he walked away, Alina Sterling fell into step beside him, tucking her arm through his. Ethan didn't look back, but Leela's phone buzzed one last time. Ethan 11:45 a.m., counting the seconds, 7 hours to go. Leela leaned against the mahogany table, her legs finally giving out. She looked out at the ocean, the blue waves crashing against the cliffs. The weekend escape was almost over, but the fire they had started in the Hamptons was coming back to New York with them. The gossip would follow, the risks would increase. But as she felt the lingering heat of his touch on her hand, Leela knew she was beyond caring. The texts were just words. The reality was going to be a masterpiece of forbidden passion. Chapter 13, Tension Breaks. The return to Manhattan had been like a bucket of ice water to the face. The Hamptons had been a fever dream of salt air, moonlit windows, and a reckless sort of freedom. But the moment the black town car crossed the Queensboro Bridge and the steel and glass canyons of the city swallowed them whole, the masks had to go back on. For 3 days, Leela and Ethan had lived in a state of agonizing professional distance. In the office, they were a study in clinical efficiency. Ethan was sharper than ever, his voice a whip that kept the entire 42nd floor in a state of constant, low-level panic. Leela was his shield, his gatekeeper, her face a mask of cool indifference even as her body burned every time he walked past her desk. The rumors had intensified. Sarah from marketing hadn't missed the way Ethan and Leela had both been absent from the Sunday morning breakfast for the first hour, or the way Alina Sterling had departed the estate with a look of icy fury. The whispers in the break room were now a dull roar, but Leela ignored them. She had a job to do, and she had a secret to keep. It was Tuesday night, just past 8:00 p.m. The cleaning crews were moving through the lower floors, but the 42nd floor was silent. A summer thunderstorm had rolled in over the Hudson, and rain was now lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the city lights into a blurred, impressionistic smear of neon. Leela was at her desk, the glow of her monitor the only light in the reception area. She was finishing the final draft of the Tokyo merger, the project that had started it all. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the keys, but her mind was 10 feet away, behind the heavy oak doors of Ethan's office. She knew he was still there. She could see the faint sliver of light beneath his door. The intercom buzzed, the sound jarring in the empty suite. "Leela, come in here." His voice was different tonight. It wasn't the commanding bark of the CEO or the playful growl of the lover. It sounded frayed, taut, like a wire stretched to the point of snapping. Leela stood up, her heart already beginning its familiar, frantic dance. She smoothed her skirt, took a breath of the recycled office air, and pushed open the doors. Ethan wasn't behind his desk. He was standing at the window, his forehead pressed against the cool glass, watching the rain. His jacket was gone. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war all day and was finally laying down his arms. "You're still here," he said, not turning around. "You haven't dismissed me, sir." "I told you to stop calling me that when we're alone," he murmured. He finally turned, and the sight of him made Leela's breath hitch. His hair was messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes were dark with a mixture of exhaustion and a raw, naked hunger. "The Tokyo report is finished," Leela said, trying to maintain the professional boundary that felt like it was dissolving into the shadows of the room. "I just need your signature on the final." "I don't care about the report, Leela." Ethan walked toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely focused. He stopped a foot away, his presence filling her senses until there was nothing else. The scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch, he'd clearly had a drink, wrapped around her. "I've spent the last 72 hours pretending I don't want to scream every time you walk into a room," he whispered. "I've sat through 4 board meetings today, listening to men talk about profit margins, while all I could think about was the way you looked in that green silk dress on Saturday night." "Ethan, we have to be careful," Leela said, though she was already leaning into him, her body betraying her words. "The rumors. Sarah is watching us like a hawk, if we're not perfect out there." "I'm tired of being perfect," he growled. He reached out, his hands sliding into her hair, his thumbs stroking her jawline with a possessive intensity. "I'm tired of the masks. I'm tired of the glass walls. I'm tired of being the man everyone expects me to be." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was heavy, ragged. "I need you, Leela, not as my assistant, not as my secret, I need to feel you." The tension that had been building since their return to the city finally broke. It wasn't a slow transition, it was a collapse. Leela wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down, and their lips met in a collision that was more than just a kiss. It was a release. It was a desperate, starving reclamation. Ethan let out a low, guttural sound and backed her up until her spine hit the heavy oak door. He reached behind her, his hand fumbling for a moment before the lock clicked into place with a definitive, heavy thud. The sound seemed to signal the end of the world outside. He hiked her up, his hands strong under her thighs, and Leela wrapped her legs around his waist, her skirt bunching up around her hips. She didn't care about the fabric or the wrinkles or the prim image she had spent the day cultivating. She wanted the heat of him. She wanted the friction. Ethan buried his face in her neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there, making Leela cry out. The sound echoed in the high-ceilinged office, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the steady drum of the rain against the windows. "You're mine," he muttered against her skin, his voice thick with a dark, heavy possessiveness. "Say it, tell me you're mine." "I'm yours," Leela gasped, her fingers digging into his shoulders. "Always, Ethan, please." He carried her across the room, not to the desk this time, but to the large leather sofa in the corner. He laid her down, the dark leather cool against her skin, and followed her down, his body a heavy, welcome weight. The office, usually a place of logic and cold ambition, had been transformed into a sanctuary of raw emotion. Every touch was heightened, every breath a prayer. Ethan stripped away the barriers of their clothing with a frantic, focused energy, as if he were trying to find the truth beneath the layers of their corporate identities. When he finally looked at her, truly looked at her, the mask was gone. There was no CEO, no boss, just a man who was hopelessly, dangerously in love with the woman beneath him. "I've never felt like this," he confessed, his voice a raw whisper. "Not with anyone. It's like I've been living my life in black and white, and then you walked in and everything turned to fire." "Then let it burn," Leela replied, pulling him down to her. They moved together with a rhythm that was both desperate and perfectly synchronized, a dance they had been practicing in their minds for weeks. The storm outside raged on, the lightning illuminating the office in jagged flashes of white, but inside, the only storm that mattered was the one they were creating together. Desire overtook restraint. The dangerous game they had been playing had reached its climax, and there was no going back. As Leela felt the world splinter into 1,000 points of light, she knew that she wasn't just surrendering to Ethan Miller. She was surrendering to a future that was as uncertain as it was beautiful. The tension had broken, and in its place was something far more powerful. As they lay together in the aftermath, the only sound the fading thunder and the rhythmic ticking of the gold clock on the wall, Ethan pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "We can't go back after this, Leela," he murmured, his voice steadying. "The office, the career, it's all going to change." "I know," she said, her heart finally finding its slow, steady beat. "Are you scared?" Leela looked up at him, at the man who was her ruin and her salvation. She thought about the gossip, the risks, and the glass towers of Manhattan. Then she thought about the way he had looked at her when he thought the world was ending. "No," she said, and for the first time in her life, she meant it. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Chapter 14. Secrets and Vulnerabilities. The storm had passed, leaving the city in a state of dripping, humid silence. Inside the executive suite, the air was heavy with the scent of rain, leather, and the lingering heat of their shared surrender. Leela sat on the edge of the sofa, the silk of her slip dress, the one she had worn under her professional exterior, feeling like a second skin. Ethan was standing by the small bar in the corner of his office, his back to her. He had pulled on his trousers but hadn't yet reached for his shirt. The muscles of his back shifted under the dim amber light, a landscape of strength and hidden scars that he rarely showed the world. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, his finest scotch, and walked back to her. He didn't sit in his high-backed executive chair. He sat on the floor at her feet, leaning his head against her knees. It was the most vulnerable position she had ever seen him in. The king of Miller Enterprises, literally at her feet. My father used to say that a man in my position doesn't have the luxury of secrets, Ethan said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He stared into his glass, the ice clinking softly. He said that every weakness is a target and every emotion is a crack in the armor. Leela reached out, her fingers tentatively brushing his dark hair. Is that why you built the lion's den? To keep everyone from seeing the cracks? Ethan let out a short, dry laugh. The lion's den wasn't my idea, it was a branding strategy, but I leaned into it because it was easier than the truth. The truth is, Leela, I didn't want this, any of it. Leela froze. You didn't want the company. I wanted to be an architect, he confessed, and the words seemed to cost him something. Real architecture, not just sterling global synergy and market acquisitions. I wanted to build things that actually meant something, but my brother, the one who was supposed to take over, he died when I was 22. A skiing accident in Switzerland. My father didn't mourn, he just looked at me and said, "You're up, Ethan, don't fail the name." He took a long swallow of the scotch, his throat working. I've spent 15 years being a ghost in a suit, building a kingdom I didn't ask for, to satisfy a man who's been dead for 5 years. And until you walked in here with that, I don't bleed easily look in your eyes. I had forgotten what it felt like to actually want something for myself. Leela felt a lump form in her throat. She had seen the titan, the shark, the demanding boss. But this, the boy who wanted to build instead of buy, the man who felt like a ghost, this was the secret she hadn't known she was looking for. "You're not a ghost, Ethan," she whispered, leaning down to press a kiss to the top of his head. "Not to me." He turned, looking up at her. In the shadows, his eyes were soft, filled with a raw, aching gratitude. He reached up, taking her hand and pressing her palm to his cheek. "You see me, Leela, not the CEO, not the Miller name, just me. And that's the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced." "Why terrifying?" "Because if you see me, you can break me," he murmured. "And I don't think I'd mind if you did." The emotional bond that had been flickering between them since the first day finally caught fire, deepening into something far more profound than physical attraction. It wasn't just about the heat of the office or the thrill of the forbidden anymore. It was about the sanctuary they found in each other's vulnerabilities. Leela realized then that her career goals had shifted. She still wanted to lead, she still wanted to build her own kingdom, but she no longer wanted to do it in a vacuum. She wanted to be the person who looked behind the armor. "I won't break you, Ethan," she promised, "but I won't let you hide either." Ethan stood up, pulling her with him. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heart against her own. They stood there in the center of the dark office, surrounded by the blueprints of a life he hadn't chosen, finding a new foundation in each other. "The rumors aren't going to stop," Ethan said into her hair. "In fact, they're going to get worse. Marcus, Sarah, they're starting to put the pieces together, and Alina Sterling isn't the type to go away quietly. She sees you as a threat to the legacy." "Let her," Leela said, her voice gaining a new edge of steel. "I'm not afraid of Alina, and I'm not afraid of the rumors." Ethan pulled back, a genuine, proud smile touching his lips. "I know you aren't, that's why I'm in trouble." He picked up his discarded shirt, but before he put it on, he stopped. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound sketchbook. It was worn, the edges frayed. He handed it to her. Leela opened it. The pages were filled with intricate, beautiful drawings of buildings, soaring towers of glass and wood, homes that looked like they grew out of cliffs, cathedrals of light. "I haven't shown this to anyone in 10 years, Ethan said. "Not even my mother." Leela flipped through the pages, her heart aching at the sheer talent and passion visible in every line. "Ethan, these are incredible. Why aren't you building these?" "Because I was busy building Miller Enterprises," he said. He took the book back, but he didn't put it in the drawer. He set it on top of the desk, right next to the Tokyo merger files. But maybe it's time to change the plans. In that moment, the secrets were no longer barriers. They were the glue holding them together. The office romance had moved past the forbidden love phase and into something real, something grounded. As they walked out of the building together, keeping a respectful distance for the sake of the late-night security guards, but sharing a look that was more intimate than any touch, Leela knew the stakes had changed. They weren't just protecting a secret anymore. They were protecting a future. Chapter 15. The Temptation Peaks. By Thursday, the professional facade wasn't just cracking, it was shattering. The emotional intimacy of the previous night, the sketchbook, the shared secrets, the raw vulnerability hadn't calmed the fire between them. It had only added high-octane fuel. Now, every "yes, mister." Miller felt like a lie, and every "thank you, Miss Vance" sounded like a caress. The air in the office felt pressurized, as if the oxygen had been replaced by pure, combustible desire. "We have the gala tonight," Leela said, standing in front of Ethan's desk. She was wearing a cream-colored silk suit that looked perfectly modest, but beneath the fabric, her skin felt sensitized, humming with the memory of his touch. Ethan didn't look up from his tablet, but his jaw tightened. "The Metropolitan Hospital benefit. I'm expected to make a speech. You're expected to manage the donor list." "I've already coordinated with the event staff," she said, stepping closer. "Your tuxedo has been delivered to your penthouse. I've scheduled the car for 7. Ethan finally looked up. His eyes were dark, rimmed with the evidence of another sleepless night. He didn't look at her face. His gaze dropped to the way her silk jacket pulled slightly across her chest. "7 is too late," he muttered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "The red carpet starts at—" "I don't care about the red carpet." He stood up, the movement so sudden it made Leela catch her breath. He walked around the desk, his presence expanding until he occupied every inch of her awareness. "I want you in that car at 6:30. I want the partition up, and I want you to tell me exactly what you're wearing under that suit." Leela's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. "Ethan, we're in the office. Anyone could walk in." "The door is locked, Leela. I checked it the moment you stepped inside." He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "The temptation is becoming a problem. I can't hear what my board is saying because I'm imagining the taste of your skin. I can't read a contract because I'm thinking about how you sounded when I held you last night." He leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers. "I'm losing my grip, and the worst part is I don't want to find it." The car ride to the gala was a study in reckless surrender. The black Cadillac Escalade moved smoothly through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan. Inside the rear cabin, the world was reduced to shadows, leather, and the heavy scent of Ethan's cologne. The privacy partition was up, a solid wall of black glass that turned the vehicle into a moving sanctuary. Leela was dressed in her gala armor, a floor-length midnight blue gown with a slit that climbed dangerously high up her thigh. Ethan was in a black tuxedo, looking like a dark prince. He didn't wait for the car to leave the curb. The moment the doors closed, he pulled her into his lap. Leela gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders for balance as her silk skirts billowed around them. "Ethan, the driver." "Can't hear a word," he rasped, his hands sliding up the silk of her gown, his palms hot against her bare skin. And he knows better than to look. His mouth found hers with a ferocity that made her head spin. This wasn't the tender, vulnerable Ethan of the night before. This was the man who took what he wanted, the man who was tired of waiting, tired of the rules. He kissed her until her lungs burned, his tongue claiming her with a possessive intensity that demanded everything. His hands were everywhere, mapping the curve of her waist, the swell of her hips, the heat of her inner thigh. "You're so beautiful it hurts to look at you," he whispered against her lips. "I spent the whole day watching you move around that office, knowing that in a few hours I'd have you right here." Leela leaned her head back, her eyes fluttering shut as he trailed his lips down her throat, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin near her collarbone. "We have to go inside in 10 minutes. I have to look professional." "You look like a queen," he murmured. His fingers found the edge of her gown's bodice, tugging it just enough to reveal the lace of her bra. "My queen, not the office's, mine." The chemistry was undeniable, a physical force that made it impossible to maintain restraint. They were playing a dangerous game, pushing the boundaries of what they could get away with in the back of a car, in the middle of a city where every eye was on Ethan Miller. The car slowed, the lights of the museum's grand entrance flickering through the tinted windows. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her. His hair was slightly mussed, his eyes blazing with a raw, unfiltered hunger. He reached out and smoothed her hair, his touch suddenly, heartbreakingly gentle. "I have to go out there and be the man they expect," he said, his voice thick. "But the whole time I'm on that stage, the whole time I'm shaking hands with governors and CEOs, I want you to remember this. I want you to remember how I feel inside you. Because as soon as this night is over, Leela, I'm not letting you go." He helped her adjust her dress, his fingers lingering on her skin as if he couldn't bear to break the contact. When the door opened, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi were blinding. Ethan stepped out first, the cold, composed CEO instantly reappearing. He turned and offered his hand to Leela, his touch professional, his face a mask of polite indifference. Leela took his hand, her legs feeling like lead. As they walked up the red carpet together, the CEO and his impeccably efficient assistant, no one saw the way her hand trembled in his. No one saw the way his thumb did a slow, secret circle against her palm. The temptation had peaked. The secrecy was becoming a burden that was almost too heavy to carry. Inside the grand ballroom, surrounded by the elite of New York, Leela stood a few feet behind Ethan as he worked the room. She watched the way women looked at him, the way men deferred to him. And she felt a fierce, burning pride. They thought they knew him, they thought they saw the whole picture. But she knew the architect, she knew the ghost, and she knew the man who had just claimed her in the back of a car. As Ethan turned to look at her from across the room, a glass of champagne in his hand, he gave her a look that lasted only a fraction of a second. It was a look of pure, unadulterated promise. The game was no longer about if they would be caught. It was about how long they could survive the heat before they both went up in flames. Chapter 16. A Dangerous Game. The morning after the gala was draped in a deceptive, silver fog that clung to the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Inside the offices of Miller Enterprises, the air was brittle. The high-gloss glamour of the museum ballroom had been replaced by the sterile, fluorescent reality of the 42nd floor, and for Leela, the transition felt like a physical bruise. She sat at her desk, her back straight, her fingers flying across her keyboard with a mechanical precision that masked the fact that her soul was screaming. Every time the elevator doors chimed, she flinched. Every time a colleague paused near her desk, her heart did a frantic, suffocating roll. The dangerous game had moved into its most volatile phase, the phase where the players start to lose control of the board. It started at 10:15 a.m. with an anonymous email sent to the general HR tip line, CC'd to the executive board. Leela only knew about it because Marcus, looking paler than she'd ever seen him, beckoned her into a conference room and closed the blinds. "Leela," he said, his voice unusually thin. "I've tried to look the other way. I like you. I think you're the best thing that's happened to this floor in years, but someone is out for blood." He turned a laptop screen toward her. It was a grainy, low-light photograph taken through the tinted glass of a black SUV. You couldn't see faces clearly, but you could see the silhouette of a man in a tuxedo and a woman in a midnight blue gown. They were entwined, the woman's leg draped over the man's lap, their bodies fused in a way that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. The caption read, "The King and His Concubine. Is this how Miller Enterprises conducts business now?" Leela felt the blood drain from her extremities. The room tilted. "Marcus, Don't," Marcus interrupted, holding up a hand. "If you confirm it to me, I have to document it. Right now, it's an unverified allegation. But Sarah from marketing has been whispering to the board members' assistants. She's claiming there's more evidence. A sketchbook, something about the Hamptons." Leela felt a cold spike of terror. The sketchbook. Ethan had left it on his desk. She had thought they were alone, but in this building, the walls had ears and the glass had eyes. "Ethan needs to know," Leela whispered. "He already does," Marcus said grimly. "The board has called an emergency session for noon. They're questioning his judgment and the potential for a hostile work environment lawsuit. Leela, if this goes south, he stays. You go. That's how the machine works." Leela walked back to her desk, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She looked toward the oak doors. They were closed. For the first time since she'd started, she felt a barrier between her and Ethan that wasn't made of professional etiquette, it was made of survival. She didn't wait for him to buzz. She stood up, walked to the doors, and entered without knocking. Ethan was standing by the window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The set of his shoulders was rigid, a fortress of tension. He didn't turn around when she entered. "They have a photo," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," Ethan replied. He turned slowly. He looked older than he had the night before. The predatory fire in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating steel. "The board is meeting in an hour. They want ahead. They want to hear that I've terminated the distraction." Leela flinched at the word distraction. Is that what I am now? Ethan crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing her by the upper arms. His grip was fierce, almost painful. "Don't you dare think that. You know exactly what you are to me. But the game has changed. They aren't just attacking a fling anymore, they're attacking my ability to lead. If they take the company from me, I lose the only leverage I have to protect you." "Protect me?" Leela laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Ethan, if they fire me, my career is over. I'll be the girl who took down a CEO. No one will hire me. I'll be a punchline." "I won't let that happen," he growled. He pulled her flush against him, his forehead resting against hers. "I have a plan, but it's risky. It requires us to play the villain for a little while longer." "What do you mean?" "I'm going to tell them the truth, partially. I'm going to tell them we've developed a relationship, but that it began after the Hamptons. I'm going to offer them a choice. Either they accept a formal disclosure and a restructuring of your reporting lines, or I walk. And if I walk, I take the Tokyo merger and the sterling global contacts with me." Leela's eyes widened. "You'd blackmail your own board." "For you, I'd burn the whole building down, he whispered. The danger of the situation seemed to heighten the electricity between them. In the shadow of a professional execution, the desire they felt was no longer just a luxury, it was a lifeline. Ethan's hand slid up to her throat, his thumb pressing against the pulse point that was thrumming like a trapped bird. "They think they can scare me into letting you go," he murmured, his lips ghosting over hers. "They don't realize that they've just given me a reason to fight. I spent 15 years building a kingdom I didn't want. Now I have a reason to keep it." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of iron and salt. It was a declaration of war. "Go back to your desk," he commanded, pulling away with visible effort. "Act like nothing is wrong. Don't speak to Sarah. Don't speak to Marcus. Just be the woman who doesn't bleed easily." The next 2 hours were the longest of Leela's life. She sat at her desk, a silent observer to the corporate machinery turning against her. She watched the board members file into the conference room, gray-haired men and sharp-eyed women who held her future in their manicured hands. Sarah from marketing walked past, a triumphant smirk on her face. "Nice suit, Leela," she whispered. "Hope you kept the receipt. You might need the cash soon." Leela didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the Tokyo spreadsheets, her fingers steady. "I don't bleed easily," she repeated to herself like a mantra. Inside the conference room, she could hear the muffled sounds of raised voices. She heard Ethan's low, rhythmic rumble, punctuated by the sharp interjections of the chairman. The air on the floor felt thick, the other employees whispering behind their hands, watching the drama unfold through the glass. Then the doors opened. The board members walked out first. Their expressions were unreadable, a mix of irritation and reluctant respect. They didn't look at Leela. They headed straight for the elevators. Finally, Ethan emerged. He didn't look like a man who had been defeated. He looked like a man who had just won a bloody, expensive victory. He walked straight to Leela's desk. The entire office went silent, the clicking of keyboards stopping in a wave of anticipation. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice carrying across the floor. "My office. We have a new set of protocols to discuss." Leela stood up, her heart in her throat. She followed him into the office, the door clicking shut behind her. Ethan turned, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face. They blinked. "What happened?" "I gave them the ultimatum. They realize that without me, the stock price drops 30% by morning. They've agreed to a private disclosure. You're being promoted to a junior analyst role in the acquisitions department. You'll report to the head of finance, not to me. Officially, our relationship is being monitored for conflicts of interest." Leela felt a wave of relief so powerful she had to lean against the desk. "I'm not fired." "You're moving up," he said, stepping into her space. He reached out and cupped her face, his eyes burning with a fierce, possessive pride. "But there's a catch." "What catch?" "We can't be seen together outside of work for the next 90 days. No galas, no shared cars, no Hamptons." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "Which means every moment we steal, every secret we keep, has to be worth the wait." Leela looked at him, the man who had just risked his legacy for her career. The danger hadn't gone away, it had just changed shape. They were no longer just a boss and an assistant, they were partners in a scandal, two people who had looked at the abyss and decided to jump together. "I think I can make it worth the wait," she whispered, her hands finding the buttons of his vest. The game was far from over. Rumors would still swirl, and Sarah would still watch. But as Ethan pulled her into his arms, the risk only made the reward feel more certain. They were playing for keeps now. Chapter 17. The Heart Speaks. The move from the 42nd floor to the 38th felt like an exile into a world of beige cubicles and the frantic clatter of keyboards. As a junior analyst in the acquisitions department, Leela was no longer the gatekeeper to the king. She was a soldier in the trenches. For 2 weeks, she had been buried in data. She stayed late, arrived early, and maintained a mask of such frigid professionalism that even the most seasoned analysts kept their distance. The 90-day no-contact rule was a physical ache. In the office, she saw Ethan only from a distance, a silhouette in the glass elevator, a deep voice echoing in a hallway, or a brief, clinical nod during a departmental briefing. But tonight was different. The rain was a soft, persistent gray veil over the city when Leela's phone buzzed in her purse. There was no name, just a string of coordinates that she knew by heart. It was the service entrance of the Riva Towers, Ethan's private residence. When she arrived, the elevator rose in a stomach-flipping rush to the penthouse. When the doors slid open, she wasn't met with the mahogany and marble of the office. This was a sanctuary of glass, charcoal-colored velvet, and the soft, orange glow of a fireplace. Ethan was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering grid of Manhattan. He had discarded his suit for a soft black cashmere sweater and dark trousers. He looked younger, less like a titan and more like the man who had shown her his sketchbook. "You're early," he said, turning toward her. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the hardness in his eyes. "I couldn't wait any longer," Leela admitted, her voice trembling as she dropped her coat. "Being on the 38th floor, it feels like I'm living in a different country. I see you, but you aren't there." Ethan crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't pull her into a frantic kiss. He didn't claim her with the possessiveness of the boardroom. Instead, he simply took her hands in his thumbs tracing the knuckles he'd been forced to ignore for 14 days. "It's been the longest 2 weeks of my life," he whispered. "I walk past your old desk, and for a second I forget you're gone. I start to say your name to ask for a file, and then I remember. The office feels empty. Not just quiet, empty." He led her toward the sofa, but instead of sitting, he guided her to a small table where 2 glasses of wine and a thick folder sat. Leela's heart sank. "More work, Ethan, even here." "No," he said, a faint, nervous smile touching his lips. "Not work, open it." Leela opened the folder. Inside were architectural plans, blueprints for a project that looked nothing like the commercial skyscrapers Miller Enterprises typically acquired. It was a community center, a soaring structure of sustainable wood and glass designed to catch the light in a way that felt like a cathedral. In the corner of the lead page, the architect's signature was simple, E. Miller. "You're doing it," she breathed, her eyes filling with tears. "You're building it." "I'm submitting it to the city commission," Ethan said, standing behind her, his chest warm against her back. "I realize that if I'm going to fight the board, if I'm going to risk my reputation for the woman I want, then I should also be the man I actually am. I don't want to just buy things anymore, Leela. I want to create them." He turned her around, his hands resting on her waist. The air in the room was thick, not with the familiar hum of lust, but with something far more terrifying, truth. "I've spent my whole life being what people needed me to be," Ethan began, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic vibration. "I was the perfect son, the perfect CEO, the perfect shark, but with you, I don't have to be perfect. You saw the ghost before I even knew he was there." Leela looked into his eyes, those icy blue depths that were now burning with a steady, warm flame. "I saw the man who was hiding behind the desk, Ethan." Leela, listen to me, he said, his grip tightening slightly. I thought what we had was just friction. I thought it was the thrill of the forbidden, the heat of the office. I told myself that once the newness wore off, I'd be able to go back to my quiet, controlled life. He paused, a raw vulnerability crossing his face. But I was wrong. The further you are from me, the more I realize that you aren't just a part of my day. You're the reason the day matters. I'm not just attracted to you, Leela. I'm in love with you, completely, irrevocably. Leela's heart stopped. She had heard him growl her name in the dark. She had heard him claim her as his. But this was a surrender. The great Ethan Miller had laid down his sword. In that moment, the realization hit Leela like a physical blow. For weeks, she had told herself this was about power, about the thrill of the boss, about her career. But as she looked at the man who was willing to change his entire life just to be seen by her, the truth cracked her wide open. I thought I was just saying yes to the boss, she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought I was playing a game to see how high I could climb. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. But it's not the boss I want, Ethan. It's you. I love you. Not the CEO, not the architect, just the man who holds me when the world is watching. The kiss that followed wasn't a collision. It was a conversation. It was soft, lingering, and filled with the weight of their twin confessions. The forbidden love had transitioned into something far more dangerous, a partnership. As they stood there in the quiet of the penthouse, high above the prying eyes of the city, the 90-day rule felt like a minor inconvenience. The board could take the office. Sarah could keep her gossip. The heart had spoken, and for the first time in both of their lives, they were finally listening. Chapter 18, Breaking Point. The peace of the penthouse felt like a distant memory by Tuesday afternoon. The corporate world, Leela was learning, didn't just let go. It waited for the perfect moment to strike. She was staring at a spreadsheet on the 38th floor when her new manager, David, called her into his office. He didn't look at her with the usual coldness of the finance team. He looked at her with pity. Leela, the board has fast-tracked your career development plan, he said, sliding a thick packet across the desk. It's a promotion, Senior Analyst of Global Acquisitions. It's an incredible jump. More money, more responsibility, and a direct path to a VP role within 5 years. Leela's heart soared for a fraction of a second until she saw the fine print. The position is based in the London office, David continued. Effective immediately, your flight is booked for Friday. Leela felt the air leave the room. London, I didn't apply for a transfer. The recommendation came from the top, Leela. It's signed by the chairman and the CEO. Leela's eyes locked onto the bottom of the page. There it was, the sharp, slanted signature she knew better than her own. Ethan Miller. The world shattered. The confessions in the firelight, the blueprints, the I love you, it all felt like a beautiful, elaborate lie. He had promised to fight for her, but instead, he had signed the order to send her 3,000 miles away. He was protecting the company. He was protecting his legacy. He was getting rid of the problem. Leela didn't wait for the elevator. She took the stairs, her heels clicking a frantic, angry rhythm against the concrete. By the time she reached the 42nd floor, she was trembling with a rage so cold it felt like ice in her veins. She pushed past Marcus, ignoring his protests. She didn't knock. She slammed the oak doors open. Ethan was in the middle of a call. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw her face. He hung up without a word. You're sending me to London, she demanded, throwing the packet onto his desk. Is that the plan, Ethan? hide the scandal in a different time zone? Was the "I love you" just a way to make sure I'd go quietly? Ethan stood up, his face pale. Leela, what are you talking about? The transfer, the promotion, you signed it. She pointed at the paper with a shaking finger. You told me you were building something with me, you showed me your sketchbook, and all the while you were signing my exile. Ethan picked up the paper, his eyes scanning it rapidly. His jaw tightened until a muscle jumped in his cheek. I didn't sign this. Your signature is right there. It's an autopen or a forgery, he growled, his voice vibrating with a sudden, dark fury. I haven't seen this document. I've been in meetings with the city planners all morning. I don't believe you, Leela sobbed, the anger finally giving way to a raw, agonizing hurt. It makes too much sense, Ethan. The board wins, you keep the CEO chair, and I get a promotion to stay silent. It's the perfect corporate solution. Leela, look at me. He moved around the desk, reaching for her, but she stepped back. He stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. I would never let you go. Not to London, not across the street. If I wanted to save my career, I would have fired you weeks ago. Do you really think I'm that hollow? I don't know who you are anymore, she cried. In this building, you're a shark. In the penthouse, you're a dreamer. Which one is real, Ethan? Because the shark just bit me. The tension in the room was suffocating. The misunderstanding had cracked open every insecurity Leela had tried to bury, the fear that she was just a disposable asset, a distraction in the life of a powerful man. The dreamer is real, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. But the shark is what I have to be to keep them from destroying you. This is Alina, or the chairman. They're trying to divide us because they know that together we're a threat to their control. He stepped closer, and this time she didn't move away. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears that were streaming down her face. I'm not sending you anywhere. If they want you in London, they'll have to drag us both there. I'll resign before I let them separate us again. You'd give it all up? She asked, her voice a broken whisper. The company, the power, everything your father built. It was never mine to begin with, Leela, he said, his eyes burning with a fierce, absolute clarity. You're the only thing in my life that I actually chose. I'm done playing their game. The breaking point had been reached, but instead of shattering them, it had forged something new. The fear of losing each other had finally outweighed the fear of the scandal. We have to go to them, Leela said, her strength returning. Together, right now. No more secrets, Ethan asked, no more secrets. Ethan grabbed his jacket, but before they reached the door, he stopped. He looked at the desk, at the corporate world he had inhabited for 15 years, and then he looked at Leela. The 90-day rule ends today, he said. He leaned down and kissed her, not a secret kiss in the dark, but a bold, defiant kiss right in front of the glass walls, in full view of Marcus, Sarah, and the entire 42nd floor. The office went dead silent. The rumors were no longer whispers, they were facts. As they walked out of the office, hand in hand, Leela felt a terrifying sense of freedom. They were heading toward a confrontation that could end both of their careers, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't worried about the climb. She was already at the top. Chapter 19, Ultimate Surrender. The world outside the penthouse windows was a chaotic swirl of city lights and a news cycle they had just set on fire. Within minutes of their defiant walkout, phones had begun to blow up. Board members were screaming, Sarah was likely leaking every detail she could fabricate, and the Miller scandal was the only thing anyone in the financial district was talking about. But as the elevator doors of the Riva Towers hissed shut, the noise died. In the silence of the private foyer, Ethan didn't wait. He didn't even reach for the light switch. He pinned Leela against the cool wood of the wall, his body a heavy, solid weight that she welcomed with every fiber of her being. "No more boardrooms," he rasped, his breath hot against her ear. "No more London. No more lies." "Just us," Leela whispered, her fingers frantically working the buttons of his shirt. She was done with the suit, done with the armor. She wanted to feel the man who had risked a billion-dollar empire for the chance to hold her hand in public. Ethan's mouth found hers, and this time, the kiss wasn't a question or a challenge. It was an answer. It was the ultimate surrender of two people who had spent their lives climbing different mountains, only to realize they wanted to stand on the same peak. He lifted her, her legs locking around his waist, and carried her through the darkened living room toward the master suite. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the Hudson River, casting a liquid silver glow over the charcoal sheets of the bed. He laid her down, the movement slow and reverent. As he stripped away the final remnants of their professional lives, the designer jacket, the silk blouse, the high-heeled shoes, he looked at her as if she were the only thing of value he had ever owned. "I've spent 15 years acquiring assets," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he joined her on the bed. He trailed his hand from her shoulder down to her hip, his touch setting her skin on fire. "But I never knew what it felt like to actually possess something that mattered. You aren't an acquisition, Leela. You're my salvation." Leela reached out, her hand sliding over the hard, familiar planes of his chest, feeling the frantic thrum of his heart. "Then stop being the boss, Ethan. Just be mine." He let out a low, guttural sound, a mix of a groan and a laugh, and leaned down to kiss her. This was the moment the tension finally, fully broke. Every lingering doubt, every fear of the future, every shadow of the dangerous game evaporated in the heat of their shared skin. The intimacy was raw and unfiltered. Without the thrill of the forbidden to sustain them, they were left with something much more powerful: a total, terrifying honesty. Ethan's hands were everywhere, mapping her body with a desperate, beautiful focus. He moved with a slow, agonizing deliberation, as if he wanted to memorize the sensation of her every curve. When he moved between her thighs, his eyes met hers, a searing blue gaze that didn't look away. "I'm going to ruin you for anyone else," he whispered, repeating his earlier promise, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was a vow. "Because I'm never letting you go back to a world where I'm not yours." Leela gasped as the first wave of pleasure hit her, her head falling back against the pillows. She felt him, the weight, the heat, the incredible strength of a man who had finally found his home. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down until their hearts beat in a single, frantic rhythm. In the height of their passion, there were no roles. No CEO, no assistant, no power dynamic. They were just two people, lost in the gravity of a love they had tried so hard to resist. The surrender was absolute. Leela gave him her breath, her strength, and her secrets. Ethan gave her his future, his passion, and his soul. As they reached the peak together, the world splintered into 1,000 shards of light. It was a climax that felt like a beginning rather than an end, a spiritual and physical collision that redefined everything. In the quiet hours that followed, the room was bathed in the soft, blue-gray light of the pre-dawn. They lay tangled together, the heavy duvet kicked to the foot of the bed. Leela's head was on Ethan's chest, the steady thud-thud of his heart acting as her new anchor. "They'll try to sue," Ethan said quietly, his hand stroking her hair. "The non-compete clauses, the ethics violations. It's going to be a long year, Leela." "Are you worried?" she asked, looking up at him. Ethan looked at her, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen in the office. He looked younger, lighter. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I've got the best analyst in the city on my side," he teased, his eyes twinkling. "And I've got enough in my private accounts to build 3 community centers and a house on the coast. No, I'm not worried." Leela smiled, a deep sense of peace settling over her. She had said yes to the boss, but she had ended up with the man. The risk had been astronomical, and the fallout was only just beginning, but as she watched the sun begin to rise over the Manhattan skyline, she knew she'd do it all again. The ultimate surrender hadn't made her weak, it had made her untouchable. What now? She whispered. "Now," Ethan said, pulling her closer and rolling her beneath him once more, "we start building." Chapter 20, Happily Ever After. 6 months later, the glass of the penthouse office at Miller and Vance Architecture didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a lens, focused squarely on the future. The fallout from their departure from Miller Enterprises had been exactly as Ethan predicted: loud, expensive, and messy. There had been lawsuits over non-compete clauses, a flurry of tabloid headlines about the CEO and the assistant, and a week where Leela had to change her phone number twice. But as the dust settled, the world realized something the board hadn't. Ethan Miller was the brand. When he left, the vision went with him. Leela sat at her new desk, a sleek, reclaimed wood piece that sat parallel to Ethan's in their shared top-floor studio in Chelsea. She was no longer a junior analyst or a personal assistant. She was the chief operating officer of a firm that was currently the most sought-after architectural boutique in New York. She looked down at the latest industry journal. On the cover was a photograph of the Vance Miller Community Center in Brooklyn. It was a triumph of light and wood, a cathedral for the people that had won 3 awards before the ribbon was even cut. "You're staring at it again?" A deep, familiar voice rumbled. Leela looked up. Ethan was leaning against the doorframe, a cup of coffee in each hand. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a dark charcoal sweater and jeans, his hair a little longer than it used to be, his face lacking the sharp, haunted tension of the lion's den. "I'm just admiring the builder's work," she teased, taking the coffee from him. Their fingers brushed, a habit they no longer had to hide. There were no prying eyes here, no Sarah from marketing, no board of directors. The only people who worked here were people they had handpicked, people who valued talent over gossip. Ethan leaned over her desk, placing his hands on either side of her chair, effectively caging her in, a move that still made Leela's pulse skyrocket. "The builder is admiring the partner." "We just landed the Seattle waterfront project, Leela. They want the Miller and Vance touch." Leela leaned back, looking into his icy blue eyes. They were warm now, filled with a steady, enduring light. "Is that so, Mr. Miller? It sounds like we have a very busy quarter ahead of us." "Exhausting," Ethan murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I might need my COO to stay late tonight, very late." "I think she can be persuaded," Leela whispered, "as long as the boss knows his place." Ethan let out a low, vibrant laugh, the sound of a man who was finally free. He pulled her up from the chair and into his arms. The transition from professional partners to lovers was seamless, a dance they had perfected in the months of building their new life together. "My place is wherever you are, Leela," he said, his voice dropping to that husky, possessive register that still had the power to turn her bones to liquid. "I spent my whole life looking for a kingdom, but I found a home instead." He kissed her then, a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of coffee, success, and a love that had survived the fire. The professional and the personal had finally found their equilibrium. They still challenged each other. They still argued over blueprints and budget margins. They still pushed each other to be better, sharper, bolder. But at the end of every day, the glass walls didn't matter. As the sun began to set over the Hudson, casting a golden amber glow over their studio, Ethan led her toward the large drafting table in the center of the room. He spread out a new set of plans, but he didn't look at the lines. He looked at the woman beside him. "You know," Leela said, her hand resting on his shoulder, "they still call it a scandal in the business journals. They say we played a dangerous game." Ethan wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Let them call it whatever they want. I'd lose 1,000 companies to find you again, Leela. I'd walk out of 100 boardrooms." He turned her toward him, his expression turning serious, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "Say yes, Leela." "Yes to what?" she asked, her heart hammering. "Yes to everything. To the firm, to the life, to the man who still can't believe he got the girl." Leela smiled, reaching up to tangle her fingers in his hair. She thought about the first day, the charcoal skirt, the liquid glass doors, the cold CEO. She thought about the spills, the secrets, and the ultimate surrender. She had said yes to the boss a long time ago, but today she was saying yes to her equal. "Yes," she whispered, her voice a promise that echoed in the quiet room. "Always yes." Ethan didn't say another word. He didn't have to. He picked her up, her laughter mingling with the sound of the city below, and carried her toward the private lounge they'd designed for nights just like this. The forbidden love was no longer forbidden. The dangerous game was over. And as the lights of New York began to twinkle like a million diamonds in the dark, Leela and Ethan began their newest project. A lifetime together, built on a foundation that no board could ever break. The end.